Louis XIV, the Sun King, regal, radiant, emotionally complex. The palace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye lay quiet beneath a soft blanket of morning mist in the autumn of 1638. In a candlelit chamber, Queen Anne of Austria cradled a newborn child in her arms, her eyes wide with wonder and gratitude. After many years without hope, she'd given birth to a son, a boy who would one day become the very centre of a glittering universe. They named him Louis Dieudonné, meaning gift of God, and in time the world would come to know him as Louis XIV, the Sun King. From the very beginning, Louis was surrounded by ceremony, responsibility, and whispers. As a child, he watched courtiers bow deeply and heard the rustling of silk wherever he walked. Yet beneath the golden patterns and powdered wigs, France was trembling. The kingdom was split with civil unrest and shadows of rebellion. The young prince and his mother had to flee more than once, hiding in unfamiliar rooms and sleeping under uncertain skies. The memory of that unrest never left him. Even when the world came to adore him, Louis would remember what it felt like to be vulnerable. When his father, Louis XIII, passed away, Louis was just 5 years old. Though he became king in name, the real power lay with his mother and Cardinal Mazarin. Louis watched quietly from the corners of rooms, learning not just about politics, but about power, how it looked, how it felt, and how dangerous it could be to let it slip from one's grasp. When Mazarin finally passed, all of France expected another minister to be chosen. But Louis looked at his court with calm assurance and said the words no one expected: "I shall govern alone." And so, at the age of 23, he began to shape the world in the image of his dreams. Versailles was once a modest hunting lodge, but Louis saw more. He transformed it into a palace of endless corridors and gleaming mirrors, a stage where every smile, every glance, and every whispered word was part of his play. He became the sun at the centre of a spinning world, and around him gathered stars, noblemen, artists, advisers, and most dazzling of all, the women of Versailles. Each woman who entered his orbit seemed to awaken a different part of the king's soul. There was Louise de la Vallière, shy and tender, with eyes like fading violets. She loved him not for his crown, but for his heart. She would bear his children and walk the gardens with quiet grace, never demanding, never scheming. Yet even the gentlest love can grow dim beneath the weight of a throne, and one day she withdrew, slipping softly from his life into the seclusion of a convent. Then came Madame de Montespan, a storm in lace and laughter. She was clever, bold, and unafraid to challenge kings and bishops alike. Louis adored her spirit. With her, court life bloomed in full colour. Poets praised her, artists painted her. She became not only the king's mistress, but a queen in all but name. Their love burned like sunlight on gold. Together they had 7 children. But as the years passed, clouds began to gather. A scandal swept through the court like a cold wind, the affair of the poisons. Whispers of witches, dark potions, and secret rites filled the halls. Names were spoken behind fans, and eyes looked away. Even Montespan's own name fluttered near the flames. Though never publicly accused, the rumours wounded her, and the palace that once danced with her presence grew still in her absence. She too faded from favour, replaced not by another flame, but by a quiet, unwavering light. Françoise d'Aubigné, Madame de Maintenon, was not born of noble blood. She had known hardship, lived simply, and walked the corridors of court not in satin but in silence. First she was governess to the king's children. Then, slowly, she became something more. She listened, she soothed, she offered a kind of peace the king had never known. In time, Louis married her in secret. No fanfare, no trumpets, just a quiet bond that softened his later years. She became his conscience, his calm, and his final devotion. But not all was gentle in the kingdom of the sun. War pressed against the borders. France grew weary, the fountains of Versailles still sparkled, but the people in the countryside hungered. The king, once adored as a golden god, became to many a distant figure, beautiful but unfeeling. His decisions weighed heavily, his pride more stubborn with age, and still he ruled, believing deeply in the divine right that placed a crown upon his head and responsibility upon his heart. In the end, age came to Louis as it does to all. His steps grew slower, his gaze more distant. The gardens he once strode through with pride now seemed endless. He lost many he had loved, his children, his friends, his court. Versailles, for all its beauty, became a quieter place, and in his final days he turned inward. He prayed more often, he looked longer at the sky, and as the sun began to set on his life, he asked only that his legacy not be confused with perfection. Louis XIV died in 1715, after a reign that spanned more than 70 years, the longest in European history. His body, like that of any man, was laid to rest, but his image, his palace, and his court lived on, and the women who once shaped his world remained. Echoes in silk, stories behind glass, names whispered in candlelight. Each of them had been more than companions. They were mirrors of the king himself, his youth, his passion, his fears, his need for affection in a world that only bowed. They loved him, challenged him, calmed him, and eventually left him, one by one. Yet they defined his reign as much as any treaty or battle ever could. And so, dear dreamer, let the echoes of Versailles lull you gently tonight. Hear the soft rustle of gowns in a marble corridor, the distant music of a royal ball fading behind silk curtains. Imagine candlelight dancing on golden walls, and the quiet breathing of a king who once ruled the world, but longed, above all, to be understood. As the night deepens, know that history, like dreams, is made not just by crowns and wars, but by hearts that loved, faltered, and grew wise beneath the stars. Sleep well, dear traveller of time. Sweet dreams. Queen Maria Theresa of Spain, Louis's formal queen, quiet, lonely. In the golden warmth of a Spanish morning in 1638, a small cry rang out in the Palacio del Buen Retiro in Madrid. It was the cry of an infant girl born to King Philip IV of Spain and Elizabeth of France. They named her Maria Theresa, a name noble and gentle, destined for duty. The court bustled in celebration, but Maria Theresa herself would never know the freedom of ordinary childhood. From her earliest days, she was taught not only to pray and curtsy, but to carry the weight of dynasties. Her world was tapestries, rituals, silences, and endless expectations, softly spoken but firmly kept. As she grew, the winds of European politics began to circle around her future. The Spanish Empire, though vast, was fraying at the edges, and France was rising with young ambition. War came like a slow-moving cloud between the two kingdoms, and yet peace required a union, one forged not with swords, but with marriage. So, at the age of 22, Maria Theresa left her homeland behind to marry the King of France, Louis XIV. It was a match of diplomacy, not of the heart, and as she crossed the border into a foreign land, she carried with her not joy, but quiet resolution. France welcomed her with ceremony, and Versailles bloomed with gold and music in her honour. She wore gowns of silver thread, stood beneath painted ceilings, and dined beneath crystal chandeliers, but behind her gentle smile lay a profound solitude. Louis, ever the shining sun of his court, was surrounded by brilliance, by conversation, by countless admirers, and by women who were not his queen. Maria Theresa, raised to be devout and dignified, watched in silence. She did not complain. She did not scheme. She prayed. She waited. She remained. Their marriage began with a sense of promise. For a moment the court whispered that the king might grow to love her. She was kind, patient, and gave him a son, the Dauphin, heir to the throne. Yet Louis's heart wandered elsewhere. first to Louise de la Vallière, then to the commanding Madame de Montespan, and later to the serene Madame de Maintenon. Maria Theresa remained in the background, her voice soft, her presence constant, like the ticking of a clock in a vast room. She moved through Versailles with grace. The courtiers respected her, though few truly knew her. She spoke softly in Spanish-accented French, loved her children deeply, and kept close to her ladies-in-waiting. Often she could be found in the chapel, her hands folded, her eyes lowered, her prayers murmured beneath her breath. To some she seemed distant, to others a figure of quiet dignity in a palace filled with vanity and ambition. But within her there was a gentle strength, a loyalty to duty, to faith, to the role she had been born to play. As the years unfolded, the palace changed. Children were born and sent away for political marriages. Wars came and went. Courtiers rose and fell. Louis's mistresses gained power and lost it again. But Maria Theresa stayed steady. She accepted each new chapter with composure, even as her own influence dimmed. Though she bore the title of queen, she often lived more like a shadow, respected but rarely consulted, seen but seldom heard. There were moments of sadness she kept hidden from view. When one of her daughters died in infancy, she did not weep in public. When Louis celebrated other women openly, she remained poised, but behind her stillness was a woman of deep feeling. Letters she wrote reveal a quiet longing, to be loved not as a queen but simply as herself. That love she would never truly receive. Her companionship with the king grew more formal, more distant, and yet she never turned cold. She remained devoted to her duties as wife, mother, and queen. One evening in July of 1683, after years of ill health, Maria Theresa fell gravely ill. Her body, long wearied by childbirth and silent heartache, could no longer endure. As she lay in her bed, the courtiers grew quiet, and the palace seemed to hold its breath. Louis came to her side, and though his heart had long since wandered, he was moved. "This is the first trouble she has ever given me," he whispered, a line history would remember, both tender and tragic. She passed away quietly, her life ending as she had lived it, with humility, dignity, and silence. After her death, the court grieved briefly before turning again to its rhythm of performance and politics. Louis would go on, eventually marrying Madame de Maintenon in a secret ceremony. Versailles would continue to echo with laughter, music, and intrigue. But Maria Theresa's absence left a hush behind, a softness that could not be replaced. She had not been a powerful queen nor a politically influential one, yet in her quiet way she embodied the soul of a forgotten kind of royalty, one rooted in patience, devotion, and gentle endurance. She became in memory a figure not of glory but of grace. In a world where voices rose to command and conquer, hers remained calm and steady. In history, her story may not shimmer like gold, but it lingers like the faint scent of lavender after the window is closed. Those who look closely will find in her tale a reminder that not all queens need to dazzle. Some simply remain, and in doing so, they teach us the meaning of quiet strength. Now, as you lie still beneath your own soft sheets, imagine her walking through the cool gardens of Versailles in the evening. The air is scented with jasmine, the fountains whisper gently, and the stars reflect in her calm eyes. She does not hurry. She does not demand. She walks with grace, holding her memories like folded letters, each sealed with silence. Let her story be your lullaby tonight. Not every tale must roar. Some drift like feathers. Let the hush of her footsteps guide you gently into your dreams, where no crown weighs heavy and every heart is understood. Sleep well, dear traveller of time. Sweet dreams. Madame de Montespan, fiery, ambitious mistress, enchanting and feared. In the gentle morning of October 1640, in a quiet chateau nestled within the province of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, A daughter was born to a noble but not yet illustrious family. Her name was Françoise Athénée de Rochechouart de Mortemart. From the beginning her presence seemed to shimmer, as if destiny had dipped her in sunlight. With golden hair and eyes alive with intelligence and curiosity, she was not like the other children. Where others tiptoed, she danced. Where silence was expected, she laughed. Her charm was not just in her beauty, but in the way she seemed to bend the world around her like silk in the wind. She grew up amid polished wood panels and the low murmur of French nobility. Her mother taught her piety and duty, while her father encouraged a wry sense of humour, a trait that would come to define her. At court, people began to whisper of her sharp tongue and sparkling eyes. When she laughed, it was said the chandeliers trembled with delight, but beneath the lace and grace was a mind ever turning, ever observing, ever climbing. Françoise married the Marquis de Montespan, becoming Madame de Montespan, and soon arrived at the glittering court of Louis XIV. Versailles in those years was a universe of painted ceilings, perfumed corridors, and shifting alliances. The king, bold, handsome, and absolute, was the sun around which everything turned. Madame de Montespan was not content to orbit from afar. With every glance, every quip, every gentle flutter of her fan, she drew herself closer to that burning centre. Louis, already accustomed to admiration, found in Montespan something different, something electric. She was not meek, not timid, and not silent. She challenged him, teased him, matched his wit and appetite for life. She did not wait to be chosen. She became irresistible. Their affair began in shadows but soon blazed openly, with the court watching in fascination and envy. She replaced the soft and sweet Louise de la Vallière, who withdrew quietly as Montespan's star rose. The king built apartments for her, artists painted her, poets composed verses in her honour. She became not just a mistress, but a queen of the king's heart, and of Versailles itself. For nearly a decade she reigned beside him. Their children were legitimized and showered with titles. Her influence was vast. Ministers consulted her. Nobles courted her favour. With Louis she was a tempest, loving, clever, unpredictable. The palace danced to her rhythm, and France itself felt the warmth of her presence. But stars that burned bright cast long shadows, and even at her height the whispers never ceased. She had many enemies. Some disdained her open ambition. Others feared her sharp tongue. In her wake hearts broke, alliances cracked, and jealousies festered. Yet the greatest blow came not from a rival, but from the invisible dangerous world that crept beneath the silken surface of Versailles. It began quietly. A few rumours of potions, strange prayers, dark masses held in secret chambers. Then came arrests, interrogations. The infamous affair of the poisons shook the court like thunder. Names were named, some taken from whispered confessions, others invented through fear. Among them, spoken behind closed doors and never proven, was that of Madame de Montespan. She denied everything, and the king protected her publicly. But something between them had shifted. The flame that once danced between them now flickered. Louis grew colder, more withdrawn. He turned toward the quiet, devout Madame de Maintenon, who offered serenity where Montespan had offered fire. One day, Montespan found herself no longer invited to the king's private moments. The applause had quieted. The doors once opened with a smile, now closed with politeness. Still, she remained at court, walking through marble halls that once echoed with her laughter. She watched as Maintenon slowly became the king's silent companion. Her own children, once symbols of love and triumph, were growing and leaving. The world she had ruled now passed her by like a distant melody. Eventually Madame de Montespan left Versailles entirely. The palace, with its golden mirrors and perfumed fountains, grew dim behind her. She turned not to scandal or bitterness but to reflection. She gave generously to charity, supported religious causes, and lived in relative quiet. She had known what it was to be adored by a king, to be feared by courtiers, to be whispered about across the entire realm, and now she chose peace. Her death in 1707 came not with thunder but with a sigh. There were no grand ceremonies, no royal tears, yet history did not forget her. To some she was a symbol of dangerous ambition, to others a woman of brilliant courage and fierce independence. She had loved deeply, spoken boldly, and refused to shrink into the background. Even centuries later, her presence lingers like perfume on ancient velvet, not just in portraits or names, but in the idea that women at court could shape history, not by birthright, but by wit, spirit, and sheer force of personality. She did not beg for love, she demanded it. She did not follow power, she danced with it, and sometimes led. And now, dear dreamer, as you rest beneath your own quiet ceiling, imagine her walking through a garden in twilight, not as the mistress of a king, not as a figure of scandal, but as a woman who lived boldly in a world that both adored and condemned her. The air is still, her gown brushes the grass. Above, the stars begin to glow, and in her eyes there is no regret, only memory. Let her story carry you softly into the night, a story of passion, courage, and the strength to rise and fall with grace. Sleep well, dear traveller of time. Sweet dreams. Madame de Maintenon wise, devout, later secretly his wife. The year was 1635, and in the city of Niort in western France, a child was born into a world not quite ready for her quiet strength. Her name was Françoise d'Aubigné, and her family, the noble, was cloaked in scandal. Her father was a prisoner, her mother devout and distant. Her early years were not spent among gold and brocade, but in prisons, poor houses, and cold rooms where prayers were whispered beside flickering candles. While other girls were taught to dance, Françoise learned to endure. While others played, she observed, and always she listened deeply. She was not destined for a throne or a crown. In fact, for a long while she seemed destined for nothing at all. But the girl who once had nothing would one day sit beside the most powerful man in France, not with diamonds or power, but with wisdom and grace. First, though, there would be hardship. When her parents died, Françoise was left with relatives who tried to press her into a convent, but she refused. Even then, her spirit was still, but never silent. In her early 20s, she married Paul Scarroll, a crippled but witty writer twice her age. Through him, she entered the world of literature, satire, and salons. Though her husband's body was frail, his mind was sharp, and she absorbed everything. When he died, she was left with little money, but a reputation for intellect, kindness, and wit. She became known simply as Madame Scarron. It was through a twist of courtly fate that she came to the attention of Madame de Montespan, the king's favourite mistress. Madame Scarron was asked to care for the children Louis XIV had fathered with Montespan. Children born of passion but raised in secrecy. She raised them not just with affection, but with discipline, thoughtfulness, and quiet love. The king noticed, and then, gradually, something unusual happened. In a court of glitter and excess, where masks were worn both on faces and in hearts, Madame Scarron was different. She did not flatter. She did not compete. She spoke with clarity, read with depth, and offered something the king had never found among the noise: peace. The children adored her. The courtiers began to whisper. The king gave her a title, Madame de Maintenon. At first she stood only in the background behind the mirrors of Versailles. But with each passing year her presence grew. When Madame de Montespan's influence began to fade in the shadow of scandal, Madame de Maintenon remained, steady and calm. She did not seek power, but her wisdom made her powerful. Louis began to visit her more often, not for pleasure, not for drama, but for conversation, for counsel, for comfort. Versailles, always a place of spectacle, now held a secret. one that would be quietly spoken but never officially declared, that Louis and Madame de Maintenon were married, not in a grand cathedral, not before the court, but in a private spiritual union. She, the woman once considered beneath the nobility, became the king's wife, not in title but in soul. Their marriage, though secret, shaped the final decades of Louis's reign. While once he had been dazzled by beauty and applause, now he turned inward. He became more devout, more disciplined. So did the court. Balls gave way to sermons and pleasure to policy. Some at court blamed her for the change, others admired her for it. But she did not bend to either praise or resentment. Her role was quiet but profound. She founded the school of Saint Cyr, dedicated to educating young noble women without means. She believed deeply in the power of education, not just for cleverness, but for virtue. She guided the king with a steady hand, always behind the curtain, never seeking credit. Her words were rarely recorded, but her influence can still be felt, like the soft rustle of pages in a library long after the reader has gone. Though Louis had once filled his days with splendour, it was with her that he ended his life, with prayers, stillness, and reflection. She was with him during his final hours, not as a queen crowned with jewels, but as the quiet presence who had loved him through storms and silence alike. When he died in 1715, she did not cling to position or power. Instead, she withdrew. She moved to Saint Cyr, the school she had founded, and lived out final years among the very girls she had once taught. They loved her not for who she had married, but for who she had always been, a woman of patience, thoughtfulness, and strength that did not shout. Madame de Maintenon passed away in 1719, without fanfare, without titles, but with a legacy deeper than gold or glory. She had been the heart behind the crown, the wisdom behind the power, the candle that glowed steadily through the restless winds of court. Her story, like the hush between harp notes, teaches us that greatness need not be loud, that sometimes influence is quiet, cloaked not in silks but in intention, that love, when true, does not require a crown to be real. And now, as the stars scatter across your own quiet sky, imagine her walking the gardens of Saint Cyr in the early morning mist. Her hands clasped gently, her eyes lifted to a soft light. Beneath her feet is lined with lavender. The air is cool, and peace hums like a hymn through the trees. She does not rush, she does not linger. She simply walks, with the quiet strength of one who has known power and pain, and chosen wisdoms every time. Sleep now, dear traveller of time. Let her story wrap around you like the finest velvet. You are safe in the arms of history. The night is gentle, and you are held. Sleep well, dear traveller of time. Sweet dreams. Madame de la Vallière. First. True love. Gentle. Melancholic. She was born beneath the sky of Tours in 1644, in a quiet place where the breeze from the Loire whispered through the trees and time seemed to pause for breath. Louise Françoise de la Baume-le-Blanc, later known simply as Louise de la Vallière, came into the world with eyes the colour of morning mist, and a soul so gentle that even silence seemed to lean closer when she entered a room. Her father was a military officer, noble but not wealthy. Her mother, devout and graceful, raised Louise with care, teaching her the art of humility and the poetry of restraint. The days of her childhood passed not in grandeur, but in simplicity. Gardens filled with flowers, long walks through dewy fields, soft prayers whispered in candlelit corners. When she was still young, her father died and her mother remarried, bringing Louise to the bustling and often unkind edges of the French court. She became a maid of honour, first to the Duchesse d'Orléans and later to Queen Marie-Thérèse herself. Versailles was just beginning to pulse with ambition and beauty. Louise, with her quiet ways and limping gait, an injury from youth, seemed an unlikely star. She did not sparkle like the other girls. She did not flatter. But her softness was its own kind of flame. And so it happened, slowly and then all at once, that the young king, Louis XIV, found himself looking toward her more than the others. She did not chase him, nor did she try to shine, and perhaps that was why he saw her, because in a palace of mirrors and masks she was the one true reflection. Their love bloomed in shadows, then sunlight. He would ride horses with her, read verses, laugh more freely than he ever had. With her he was not just a king but a man allowed to feel tenderness. She did not seek to control him, did not press herself forward at court. She simply loved, and in return he gave her his heart. For a time their world was made of letters, glances across gilded halls and stolen moments in quiet gardens. When she bore him a child, a son, the bond between them deepened, though it was wrapped in secrecy. More children followed and Louis legitimized them, giving them names and places. Louise's position became both precious and precarious. She was loved by the king, but she remained officially without title, without security, surrounded by courtiers who envied her and whispered daggers behind fans. Still, in the early days she carried herself with grace. Her apartments were modest, her words always soft. The courtiers called her the Little Violet, delicate, shy, and barely noticed until you looked closely, and then impossible to forget. But nothing at court stays simple for long. Enter Madame de Montespan, brilliant, bold, and dazzling in every way Louise was not. Montespan swept into court like a storm, her laughter loud, her gowns extravagant, her charm impossible to resist. Louis, always drawn to light and spectacle, began to drift. At first it was subtle, a shorter visit, a missed word. Then it became a pattern. Louise, with quiet eyes, watched the man she loved begin to turn towards someone else. What hurt most was not just losing him, it was staying beside him while it happened. For a time, the three of them lived in an unbearable arrangement. Louise, still technically the mistress, raising his children, Montespan ascending rapidly into favour and fire. The court laughed behind its hands, rumours swirled, and Louise suffered not with bitterness, but with silent sorrow. She never caused a scene. She never raised her voice. But the pain sat heavy in her soul. She began withdrawing from events, from courtiers, from joy itself. And then came the moment that changed everything. One day she fell from her horse. The accident was not serious, but the humiliation burned. Louis did not rush to her side. The courtiers barely noticed, and she realized with a clarity that pierced her heart that her place was no longer her own. She had loved deeply, perhaps too much, and now that love had nowhere to go. It was then that she turned inward, toward God, toward meaning, toward solitude. She begged the king to allow her to leave court, to live in peace far from the cruelty of Versailles. He refused. Again and again she asked. Eventually he relented, reluctantly, almost mournfully. In 1674, Louise entered the Carmelite convent in Paris. There she shed her silks and jewels, her name and position, and took the veil. She became Sister Louise Mercy. The world that had once called her mistress now called her sister, and she welcomed it, not as punishment but as healing. Her cell was bare, her hands washed floors, her prayers filled the silence she had once filled with longing. Many came to visit her, out of curiosity, nostalgia, or guilt. Montespan herself once came, weeping, seeking comfort. Louise gave it without hesitation. Her children visited too, and she received them with warmth and quiet pride. She never spoke ill of the king, never shared her pain in public. Her letters, few and private, were filled with grace. In time, the world began to forget her. New faces filled Versailles, new loves, new scandals. But in that little convent cell, Sister Louise remained constant, steadfast as the stars beyond her narrow window. She died in 1710, far from the gold and glory of the court she had once been a part of. No trumpets sounded, no paintings were commissioned. But in the stillness of her passing, there was a kind of peace, a soft end to a life that had once burned with quiet passion. And now, as you lie in your bed wrapped in the hush of night, imagine her there, Louise de la Vallière, walking through the convent gardens in early morning light. The dew glistens on the grass. The sky is just beginning to warm. Her veil flows gently behind her, and her face is calm. She has known love and sorrow, fame and retreat, and she has chosen peace. Let her story be a balm to your restless thoughts. Let her gentle strength wrap around you like a soft blanket, no longer seeking, no longer needing just stillness, just quiet, just the breath of someone who once loved with all her heart, and then let it go. Sleep well, dear traveller of time. Let Louise's gentle soul lead you into dreams full of soft echoes and calm skies. Rest easy, you are safe. Henrietta of England, Minette. Louis's sister-in-law, secret affections. The moon hung like a silver locket over St. Cloud the night Henrietta Anne of England arrived in France. The year was 1660, and though she was barely 16, the weight of kingdoms already lingered in her step. Known as Minette to her family, Henrietta had grown up not in glittering courts, but in exile, amidst the echoes of England's civil war. Her father, King Charles I, had been executed when she was just an infant. Her mother, Queen Henrietta Maria, had fled with her to France, seeking refuge under the protection of family. There, in the quiet corridors of the Louvre and convents in the countryside, Henrietta grew up far from the noise of thrones, but never far from the shadow of one. She was delicate in frame but strong in spirit, with eyes that caught sorrow as easily as sunlight. Music filled her days, along with Latin lessons, whispered prayers, and the scent of jasmine drifting in from the gardens. France became her home, but she remained a daughter of England, a child of fallen kings and fractured crowns, with a smile too soft for the weight of dynasties. When her brother, Charles II, reclaimed the throne of England, Henrietta's place in the game of alliances shifted. She was no longer the forgotten girl in exile. She became valuable, a bridge between nations. In 1661 she was married to Philippe, Duke of Orleans, younger brother of Louis XIV. It was a union of strategy, not affection, arranged to strengthen ties between England and France. Henrietta, barely 17, was now a Duchess of France, part of one of Europe's most glittering and complicated courts. Versailles shimmered around her like a dream stitched in gold thread, but dreams can sometimes press too tightly on the chest. Philippe, her new husband, was flamboyant and unpredictable. He adored fashion, jewels, and the admiration of other men. Though not unkind, he was distant. Their marriage, more spectacle than sanctuary, left Henrietta alone in a palace full of voices. She smiled, attended balls, and played the harpsichord, but often, when the halls grew quiet, she would stare out window toward the woods, her heart softly aching with the absence of closeness. Louis XIV, her brother-in-law, the Sun King himself, noticed. He had always been fond of Minette. They shared a language of gentleness and poetry, a bond rooted not in politics but in something harder to name. In the first years of her marriage, Louis would seek her out, not just for state matters, but for conversation. He admired her intelligence, her modesty, the way she could express her thoughts without force. They would talk in gardens, under trellised vines, their words low, their laughter private. Rumours bloomed, of course. This was Versailles, after all. But if there was affection between them, it remained encased in a kind of reverent restraint. Still, Henrietta shone at court. She hosted salons, wrote letters in elegant French and English, and became a trusted presence in political affairs. She was more than a duchess, she was a diplomat, a woman of tact and vision. In 1670, she travelled to England to negotiate the secret Treaty of Dover between her brother Charles II and Louis XIV, a pact cloaked in mystery, ambition, and whispers of war. She succeeded, charming the English court with her poise, rekindling bonds with her homeland, then returning to France as both sister and emissary. But something inside her had begun to dim. Her health, never robust, began to falter. She complained of intense stomach pains, of exhaustion that clung like damp linen. The court, ever dramatic, murmured of poison. Others spoke of stress, of heartache. Her relationship with Philippe had grown colder. His jealousy over her closeness with Louis festered. He forbade her trusted companions. The air around her tightened, the halls of St. Cloud narrowing like a corridor with no door. And yet, she remained composed. Even when her body trembled, even when food turned sour in her mouth, she held her grace. On the evening of June 29th, 1670, she drank a glass of chilled chicory water, and within hours was seized by unbearable pain. She cried out, collapsing, her breath frantic, her voice raw with terror. "I am dying," she said, "and I have been poisoned." Physicians surrounded her, helpless. Her mother, frantic, sent word from afar. But the end came swiftly. By morning, Henrietta was gone. She was just 26. The court plunged into a kind of mourning that felt suspended, unreal, like fog draped over chandeliers. Louis was devastated. He called her his dear sister, though the depth of their connection likely stretched far beyond such titles. Philippe, too, grieved, though whether out of guilt, loss, or reputation, no one could be sure. An autopsy declared she had died of natural causes, possibly a perforated ulcer, but rumours never died. Versailles, in its golden brilliance, continued to shimmer, but the light where Henrietta had walked now flickered low. And yet, her story did not end in scandal or bitterness. It ended in memory. Letters she wrote, filled with grace, wit, and longing, continued to be read and shared. Her charm lived in the gardens she once wandered, in the music she had played on dusky afternoons. She had been a daughter of war, a duchess of peace, and a woman who loved softly in a world too loud. Though her life was brief, her impact rippled across Europe like a sigh held in the throat too long. Now, dear dreamer, imagine her once more, walking the pale gravel paths of St. Cloud in early twilight. Her gown brushes the grass, dew clinging to the hem. The scent of orange blossoms hangs in the air. Her hair is pinned back, her hands clasped gently before her. She turns her face to the sky, not with sorrow, but with serenity. The pain is gone, the whispers silenced. Only the wind remains, humming softly through the leaves like a lullaby. And in this peace, you too may rest. Let Henrietta's gentle spirit guide you tonight. Let her softness lull you into stillness. You're far from court, far from pain, nestled in quiet. All is well now. Sleep well, dear traveller of time. Let Minette's whisper carry you gently into dreams. You are safe, and the night watches over you. Sweet dreams. Philippe IV, Duke of Orléans, Monsieur, Louis's flamboyant brother. The court of France, long before the mirrors of Versailles were polished to their glow, knew the sound of silk brushing marble and the hush that fell when royalty passed by. In the middle of this world, a child was born beneath vaulted ceilings and high expectations. His name was Philippe, and though he would never be king, his life would shimmer brighter and stranger than most who ever wore a crown. He was born in 1640, the younger brother to Louis XIV. Even as an infant, he was watched with cautious hope. He was the spare, the one who might rise if misfortune struck the air. Their mother, Anne of Austria, a formidable queen, believed in control, appearances, and power above all else. Their father, Louis XIII, distant and stern, died when Philippe was barely 3. From that moment the shadow of kingship surrounded Louis, while a different, quieter pressure surrounded Philippe. He was to remain loyal, obedient, and never too ambitious. To ensure that, their mother guided Philippe's upbringing in unusual ways. He was dressed in girls' clothing until he was 8, encouraged to remain delicate, docile, and distant from politics. Anne wanted to protect the throne, to sculpt a brother who would never rival her elder son. And yet Philippe did not grow bitter. Instead, he grew extravagant. From a young age he adored colour, dance, jewels, and fashion. He could turn a staircase into a stage, a dinner into a performance. He was not meant to rule, but he ruled the art of presence. As Louis ascended into the sun of kingship, Philippe became Monsieur, a title reserved for the king's brother, but also a symbol of perpetual second place. He accepted it, but not quietly. Philippe created a world of his own within the court, a world of laughter, drama, and silk-threaded rebellion. He was intelligent, witty, and deeply observant. While others plotted and schemed, Philippe watched, and while the court whispered, he remained unbothered, adding another gemstone to his sleeve. His marriage was, like most in those halls, political. Henrietta of England, Minette, delicate and refined, became his wife. She was his cousin and the sister of King Charles II of England. The union was meant to cement ties between nations, not hearts. Though there were moments of shared grace between them, the marriage was stormy. Philippe, flamboyant and surrounded by favourites, often left Minette isolated. She in turn formed her own close ties, including with Louis himself. Jealousy burned slowly, then furiously. Versailles became a chessboard, each move laced with emotion. And yet, Philippe played his part. He fought in wars, notably distinguishing himself at the Battle of Cassel, where he led troops with bravery that surprised many who had underestimated the man in lace and feathers. He proved that beneath the powder and wigs was a soldier's spine. The victory brought him fame, briefly allowing him to step from his brother's shadow. But Louis, wary of sharing glory, quickly removed him from military command. Philippe was to remain at court, dressed grandly, speaking softly, never stepping beyond his assigned page in the story. As time passed, Philippe's taste grew bolder. He built the lavish Château de Saint-Cloud, decorating it with fountains and mirrors, with gardens that mimicked paradise. There, he lived surrounded by men he loved openly, most notably the Chevalier de Lorraine, whose influence on him was both passionate and complicated. Philippe's relationships were no secret, and Versailles buzzed with scandal, but he no longer seemed to care. He had shaped a life on his own terms, one filled with art, music, and freedom, even if the price was whispers and exclusion from power. Henrietta died young, suddenly, and amid rumours of poison. Philippe grieved, in his own quiet way, and then remarried. His second wife, Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, was practical, plain-spoken, and fond of him in a different way. Together they had children, including the future regent of France. Though their marriage lacked romance, it was grounded in mutual understanding. She would later write hundreds of letters describing court life, filled with insight into the world Philippe had long mastered. Through all the decades, he remained a contrast to his brother. Where Louis was golden, controlled and absolute, Philippe was brilliant in colour, chaotic in love, and deeply human. Their relationship was both close and strained. Louis admired Philippe's wit and bravery, but often mocked his choices. Philippe resented Louis's control, yet always circled back to loyalty. They were bound not just by blood, but by a complicated dance of rivalry, affection, and fate. As the years wore on, Philippe aged with grace. He no longer sought approval, no longer chased a place in the sun. Instead, he walked the shaded paths of Saint-Cloud, content to be remembered not as a ruler, but as a character, flawed, extravagant, and unforgettable. He had watched kings rise and fall, watched friends perish and fashions fade. He had loved freely in a world that frowned on freedom, and somehow he endured. When he died in 1701, the court bowed, not in duty but in memory. Philippe, Duke of Orleans, had been many things: warrior, brother, husband, father, and mystery. He had never worn the crown, but he had worn the room, and perhaps that, in the end, was its own kind of royalty. Now, as you lie in stillness, picture him walking slowly through the gardens of St. Cloud. His cloak billows slightly in the evening breeze. The scent of lilac follows him. He stops to gaze at a statue, its marble face serene in moonlight. The fountains hush, the trees lean close, and the world becomes soft around him. No more court, no more duty, just the quiet footsteps of a man who loved beauty, and who dared to live brightly in a world of shadows. Let the warmth of his memory settle into your chest like a gentle sigh. Let your thoughts drift, as Philippe once did, into night skies and candlelight dreams. Sleep well, dear traveller of time. May Monsieur's bold heart and velvet laughter lull you into dreams of silk skies and peace. The night holds you now, sweet dreams. Chevalier de Lorraine, Philippe's companion and secret lover. In the golden light of a French morning, when the leaves of the chestnut trees were just beginning to turn with the quiet promise of autumn, a boy was born into a noble family. His name was Philippe de Lorraine, and though he would never wear a crown or hold vast estates of his own, his name would come to ripple through the most glittering halls of Versailles, spoken in awe, in scandal, in whispers over fans and under candlelight. He was born in 1643 into the House of Lorraine, one of the oldest noble families in Europe. The blood in his veins carried pride but little power. A noble, he was not rich. Though titled, he stood apart from the centres of control. Yet Philippe had something else entirely. He had beauty, not the shy kind that blushed and turned away, but the kind that entered a room like the scent of burning rosewood. He had long, flowing hair the colour of ash and sunlight, eyes that gleamed like melted steel, and a smile that knew more than it ever said aloud. From an early age, he understood how the world worked, not through laws or land, but through gaze and influence. In his youth, he was trained as many young noblemen were, in fencing, in court manners, in Latin and swordplay. But he mastered another language entirely, the language of power exchanged not in titles, but in trust, in charm, in silence held just long enough to draw someone in. He entered the royal court while still young, a page, then a companion, and eventually he came to the attention of the king's brother, Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, Monsieur. What began as acquaintance, perhaps a flicker across the ballroom or a conversation over wine, deepened into something far more enduring. They became companions, and more than companions. They became necessary to one another. Philippe de Lorraine was not merely a lover, he was a fixture in the prince's life, a mirror, a confidant, a tempest, a balm. Versailles was not built yet, but the world of Louis XIV was already glittering and dangerous. Behind every fan was a rival, behind every smile a scheme. The Chevalier de Lorraine knew this game, and played it well. His presence by Monsieur's side was constant. He dressed impeccably, always just a shade more daring than fashion allowed. He moved like he knew eyes would follow him, and they did. Men envied him, women gossiped about him, ministers distrusted him, but all of them noticed him. He whispered into Monsieur's ear, influenced his moods, steered his wrath. He became for a time one of the most powerful men in court without holding office. His influence over Monsieur was unsettling to many, especially to the king. Louis XIV saw the Chevalier as a disruption. The king needed his brother to be manageable, loyal, safe. But the Chevalier stirred Monsieur's pride, emboldened his jealousies, and awakened tempers that might otherwise have stayed curled like sleeping cats. When Monsieur married Henrietta of England, Minette, tension escalated. She, refined and diplomatic, grew tired of the Chevalier's dominance over her husband. She sought to have him exiled, and at times she succeeded. The Chevalier was sent away from court, only to return again, always returning. He had the kind of pull that distance could not break, and perhaps in some part of him, he believed himself immune to downfall. After all, he had survived so many seasons of scandal, so many cold glances from the king, so many warnings. Yet the court was not without its price. The Chevalier's life, though gilded, was laced with danger. He had made enemies, deep ones. He was accused of orchestrating poison plots, manipulating those around him, even of whispering curses behind closed doors. Whether these rumours held truth or simply sprang from envy, they clung to him like perfume. Still, he did not waver. He walked the halls as if they were stitched for his feet, his chin lifted, his gaze unafraid. Even after Henrietta's tragic death, sudden, painful, and drenched in suspicion, the Chevalier remained. He denied involvement, and nothing was ever proven. But the echoes of that night haunted many. He was exiled once more, then brought back again, like a tide, like something Versailles itself could not quite rid itself of. And yet, beneath the silks and the shadows, there was a man, one who had loved fiercely and imperfectly. His bond with Monsieur, while often tempestuous, lasted decades. When others came and went, when fads shifted, and fortunes rose and fell, the Chevalier endured. He remained by Monsieur's side through 2 marriages, through military campaigns, through the building of Versailles itself. In the quiet moments, when the chandeliers were dim and the music had faded, they were simply Philippe and Philippe, brothers in name but bound by something stranger. In his later years, the Chevalier began to soften. The court grew younger, faster, more glittering. He aged gracefully, retreating slight from the centre, watching as new games were played by those too young to remember when he'd ruled the gossip. He no longer needed to scheme. His name had already become legend. He took to walking the gardens more, wearing a simple cloak rather than brocade, his hair now powdered white. He would pause by the fountains, perhaps hearing the echoes of arguments and laughter long past, and smile to himself. He died in 1702 quietly, without the scandal that had so often defined his life. He was buried with honour, though not with state. Some mourned him, others sighed in relief, but all remembered him. He had never been king, nor general, nor priest, but he had shaped the lives of all 3, through charm, through love, through something that even history struggles to name. Now, in the gentle hush of night, you may picture him, not as the court saw him, but as he might have been in the moments alone. Standing at a balcony, the gardens bathed in starlight. A breeze stirs the air. His hands are clasped loosely at his back, and his eyes gaze upward, thoughtful. The game is over, the palace is still, and in the silence there is peace. Let him remain there now, in your thoughts, a figure of elegance and defiance, of laughter and longing. His world, so far from ours, still echoes with lessons, of loyalty, of danger, of the strange cost of beauty. But tonight those lessons can drift away. Let go of them. Let his story settle gently over your thoughts like falling silk. You're safe. You're at rest. Versailles is quiet and the candlelight has dimmed. Sleep well, dear traveller of twilight. Let Chevalier's whispered legacy cradle you into rest. The stars are high and all your dreams are waiting. Close your eyes. Sweet dreams. Mademoiselle de Fontanges. Young, naive, tragic beauty. There are names in history that burn like torches, remembered for power, scandal, or fire, and then there are those that pass like the scent of lilies in spring, sweet, brief, and touched by sorrow. Marie-Angélique de Scorail, better known as Mademoiselle de Fontanges, was one such name, a girl of radiant beauty, gentle spirit, and a fate that moved even the coldest hearts in Versailles. She was born in 1661 to an old noble family in the highlands of Auvergne. Far from the halls of the Sun King, her early days were shaped by forests and quiet chapels, by simple dances and the dreams of a young girl who heard only distant echoes of courtly life. Her family, proud and modest, raised her with grace, good breeding, and the kind of innocence that can only come from distance. She loved to ride horses across fields of lavender and listen to stories of queens and princesses with a quiet heart. In her teens, she was sent to Paris, chosen to serve as a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. The court, with its mirrors and intrigue, opened around her like a labyrinth of polished marble. She arrived with cheeks still rosy from countryside winds and eyes wide with awe. She was tall, golden-haired, with skin pale as ivory, and a smile that made even the old courtiers pause mid-sentence. People said she looked like a goddess who had wandered too far from the clouds. Louis XIV noticed her not long after her arrival. The king, already a man of many loves, was taken by her freshness, her simplicity, and the way she blushed when spoken to. He called her my angel. She had not come to court to seek his eye, yet it found her just the same. Soon her days were filled with whispered invitations, new gowns, and the gentle pull of power she never asked for. She became his mistress, officially, openly. The Queen withdrew in silence. The other ladies seethed in envy, and young Marie, barely 17, was crowned not with jewels, but with attention, burden, and an adoration she did not quite understand. The king gave her titles, gifts, and a promise of permanence. She became the Duchess of Fontanges, though in her heart she was still the girl from the hills. At first the attention dazzled her. She laughed in gardens, danced masked balls, and rode beside the king on hunts where trumpets sang her name. She invented hairstyle, a cascade of curls held by ribbons that all the women soon copied. The Fontaines became the fashion of the hour, towering high over the heads of courtiers. Everything about her shone, but brightness often burns too fast. She had rivals, especially the Marquise de Montespan, the king's longtime mistress and a woman of sharp wit and deeper roots. Montespan had been the sun at Versailles for years, and now Fontanges, young, shy, and seemingly effortless, had stolen the light. The tension between them crackled behind fans and curtsies. The court watched as if at theatre. But Marie did not know how to scheme. She was not raised for battle. She trusted too easily, spoke too kindly, and believed the king's affection was armour enough. Yet even kings grow distracted. After a short time, mere months really, the king's gaze began to drift again. Her innocence, once charming, now seemed quiet. Her beauty, though still luminous, became part of the wallpaper of court. And then, one day, she fell ill. At first it was a faintness, then fevers, then bleeding. Her body, once admired in silk, grew weak beneath the lace. Whispers began to circle, poison some said. Had Montespan done it? Had a jealous noblewoman slipped something into her wine? No one knew for certain, and nothing was ever proven. But the sickness lingered, drained her colour, and left her in bed for weeks, then months. The king visited less and less. Other women whispered louder. And in the soft silence of her chambers, Marie began to understand something bitter and beautiful, that love at court is rarely gentle and never safe. She died not long after, in 1681. She was just 20 years old. The court mourned her with words, flowers, and sighs, but it moved on quickly, as it always did. Her title passed to the wind. Her hairstyle faded from fashion, and the king, though he may have grieved in some quiet way, did not look back long. Versailles glittered on, and the girl who once made it pause became only a portrait in a gallery, a name carved quietly in marble. But her story lingers, not for what she did, but for what she was. A young woman caught in the glow of a golden court. She loved purely, dreamed freely, and fell like a single petal from an overfilled vase. She did not leave behind scandal, children, or politics, only the echo of her gentleness. Now, as the lights dim and the palace sleeps, imagine her walking alone through the garden paths of Versailles. Her pale dress catches the breeze. She stops beneath a rose-covered trellis, looking up at the moon. Her face is soft, her eyes clear. In this dream, she is well again, unburdened, free. She walks not as a duchess, not as a mistress, but as herself. A soul who burned briefly and beautifully. Let her story settle into your breath. Let the quiet of her memory cradle you. No drama now, no court, just peace, flowers, and the hush of history falling like a blanket. Sleep well, dear dreamer of the past. Let Marie's gentle heart carry you through the night. The stars remember her now, and they watch over you too. Sweet dreams. Duchesse de Montpensier, La Grande Mademoiselle. Proud, rebellious. She was born beneath the vaulted ceilings of a palace, her first cry echoing through corridors lined with tapestries and waiting servants. Anne-Marie Louise d'Orléans came into the world in 1627, daughter to Gaston, Duke of Orléans, brother to King Louis XIII, and Marie de Bourbon, Duchess of Montpensier. She was a princess of royal blood, the richest heiress in all of France, a child surrounded by expectations as high and as heavy as the marble columns that framed her cradle. From the very beginning, she was called La Grande Mademoiselle, a title both affectionate and imposing. She had no mother. Marie de Bourbon died when Anne was just days old, and her father, ever unstable in politics and temperament, drifted in and out of her life. Raised by governesses and surrounded by tutors, Anne grew up with a fierce independence, sharpened by solitude and crowned by pride. She was not like other girls of her time. She read politics as easily as poetry, debated with bishops, and refused to be silenced or softened. She believed she was destined for greatness, not by marriage, but by her own will. She came of age as France trembled on the edge of change. The monarchy wavered, nobles plotted, and civil war smouldered beneath the silk and lace of the royal court. Anne watched, listened, and when the moment came, she did not stand aside. During the Fronde, a series of uprisings against the young Louis XIV and his regent mother, Anne threw her support behind the rebellious princes. Not just from behind a curtain or in whispered council, she rode to battle. She donned armour, mounted a horse, and commanded troops. When Paris was under siege in 1652, it was she, La Grande Mademoiselle, who ordered the gates of the city open to the rebel leader, her cousin Condé. She stood on the city walls, cannon fire at her back, proud and unshaken. The king never forgot this. Though the rebellion eventually crumbled and the royal power was restored, Anne returned to court with her head held high. She sought favour and at times received it, but the memory of her defiance lingered like the scent of smoke after a fire. She was tolerated, admired, and watched. No one could quite dismiss her, but few dared to embrace her. Marriage proposals came and went. Some suggested she wed the king himself. Others proposed exiled princes, foreign nobles, or strategic alliances. But Anne, ever proud, refused unless the match suited her heart and her sense of stature. She had once loved the idea of marrying the cousin she'd fought beside, Condé, but politics made that impossible. Later she fell deeply, disastrously in love with a man far beneath her rank, Antoine Nompard de Caumont, Duke of Lausanne. He was bold, charming, and clever, though not nearly grand enough in blood or fortune. Their love blossomed in secret corners of Versailles, in stolen moments behind fans and closed doors. When word reached the king, Louis XIV was outraged. To marry Lausanne, Anne was forced to beg the king for permission. She wept, she pleaded, she even surrendered part of her vast inheritance. For a time Louis relented. The wedding was announced, but then, without clear reason, he reversed the decision. Lausanne was arrested, imprisoned in the fortress of Pignerol, and was devastated. Years passed. She tried everything to free him, gifts, petitions, even submission. Eventually the king relented again. Lausanne was freed. But by then, something in their love had changed. The long wait had eroded the passion. They never married. Time moved on, and Versailles shifted around her. The young girls who had once curtsied before her now held the attention of the court. Her influence faded like evening light, slow and unspoken. Yet she never bowed. She walked the corridors with dignity, her grey eyes steady, her chin lifted. She continued to write memoirs, letters, observations. Her words were sharp, brilliant, laced with both humour and regret. In a world where women were rarely heard, she carved her voice into the page, into history. She grew older, surrounded by books and mirrors, relics of her youth, and memories that rustled like silk in her mind. Sometimes, they say, she would sit at her window watching the stars and speak aloud to ghosts of her mother she never knew, her lover she never married, the armies she once led, and the city she once saved. In 1693 she died, quietly in her Paris residence. There were no cannons this time, no cries of battle, just the hush of rooms closing behind her and the gentle folding of time. She was buried with honours, remembered by some, forgotten by others. But history, though slow, does not let go of such spirits easily. Anne-Marie. Louise d'Orléans, La Grande Mademoiselle, was not a queen, but she ruled herself. She defied expectations, defied kings, and defied the silence so often imposed on women of her rank. She laughed loudly, loved fiercely, and walked into danger with her head high. And now, long after the powdered wigs have faded and the chandeliers have gone dark, her name still lingers, on pages, on stone, in dreams. Tonight, as sleep gently gathers at the corners of your eyes, picture her in the early twilight, riding across the hills of her youth, her cloak flowing behind her, her face turned toward the wind. No court, no crown, just the open sky and a freedom she always chased. Let her tale rest in your thoughts like the echo of distant hooves. Let her strength comfort you, her defiance settle into your breath, and her final peace become your own. Sleep now, dear listener of the past. Let the pride of La Grande Mademoiselle wrap you like velvet. You are safe, you are held, and the stars know your name. Sweet dreams. Madame de Sévigné letter. Writer and court observer. In a quiet corner of the French aristocracy, where minds were often sharper than swords and letters more dangerous than daggers, one woman carved her name not through power or scandal, but through words. Marie de Rabdin Chantal, who the world would later call Madame de Sévigné, was born in 1626 into nobility and sorrow. Her father died in battle before she could know him. Her mother passed soon after. By the time she was just a child, she was already an orphan, passed among relatives like a delicate heirloom, her golden curls and curious eyes attracting sympathy wherever she went. She grew up in the glow of cultured salons and candlelit libraries, learning from the clever and the powerful, nurtured not by a mother's lullabies but by the wit of noble cousins and the warmth of ink on parchment. From early on, Marie knew the weight and freedom of the written word. Her tutors praised her quick mind. Her guardians noticed her graceful presence. But she was not a girl easily moulded. There was an independence about her, a spark that danced just behind her eyes. Though born into a world that demanded silence from its daughters, she listened, she learned, and she wrote. At 18, she married the Marquis de Sévigné, a dashing man with a reputation both for charm and for risk. Their union brought her to the very heart of aristocratic life, a world of velvet, of secrets, of morning rides and midnight rumours. But the Marquis, though magnetic, was reckless. He died in a duel not long after their marriage, leaving Marie a widow before she was 30. With 2 young children and a heart neither broken nor bitter, she stepped into widowhood with a grace that would define her forever. She chose not to remarry, though many tried. Instead, she devoted herself to her children, particularly her daughter Françoise. It was this love, deep, unwavering, almost spiritual, that became the pulse of her life. And when Françoise married and moved to Provence, the distance carved a hollow in Marie's days. To fill it, she began to write. Each letter she penned to her daughter was a tapestry, threads of court gossip, reflections on politics, weather, health, philosophy, fashion, and above all, love. She wrote not merely to inform, but to preserve, to soothe, and to delight. Her words became mirrors of Versailles, of France, of life itself, captured in the flicker of a quill. And what letters they were, overflowing with cleverness, charm, and tenderness. She wrote of Louis XIV, of Madame de Montespan's intrigues, of ministers and mistresses. She did not seek drama, but simply observed it, like one watches ripples on a pond. Her gift was not only in what she wrote, but how. Light as a feather, precise as a blade, warm as a hearth. She captured the essence of a changing world with the softness of a mother's voice. She became, in time, a figure both beloved and respected. Her letters were shared, copied, and treasured, though always without her intention. She wrote for her daughter, never for fame, and yet those writings outlived the very people they described. Long after courtiers fell silent and the wigs were put away, her words danced across pages, fresh as morning dew. Though she never held a title beyond Madame, her influence stretched far. She did not wield armies or own lands, but she moved hearts and preserved memory. In her modest Paris townhouse, lined with books and flowers, she entertained quietly, choosing wit over politics, laughter over flattery. Visitors came to see her not for favour, but for truth wrapped in silk and cleverness. There were turning points, of course, moments of grief, moments of distance. Her daughter's health, the wars that raged, the deaths of friends, and the slow, aching march of time. She wrote through it all. When sorrow came, her words softened it. When joy returned, they sparkled. And in those letters one sees not just the life of a woman, but the heartbeat of an era. Years passed. Her hair greyed, her steps slowed, but her mind never dimmed. Even as the salons grew quieter and the faces around her changed, she wrote. Still to her daughter, always to her daughter. It was as if her soul flowed through the ink, bound forever to the one she had once rocked to sleep. In 1696, at the age of 70, Madame de Sévigné passed away. Her final days were gentle, surrounded by books, by friends, and by thoughts she'd spent a lifetime shaping into sentences. She did not leave behind monuments or heirs to kingdoms. She left behind something rarer, a record of a life observed with love, intelligence, and humanity. Today we know her not for the parties she attended or the titles she carried, but for the way she described a spring morning, a friend's passing, or a dinner at court. Her letters are time capsules of tenderness and truth. They do not shout, they whisper, and in that whisper we hear the world as it once was. So now, as you drift towards your own quiet night, imagine her, Madame de Sévigné, seated beside a window, candle flickering, quill in hand. Outside, the moonlight lays soft across Paris. Inside, her thoughts settle into ink, one word at a time sent into the world with care. Let her presence wrap her around you like a shawl. Let her voice settle behind your eyelids. Nothing heavy now, no kings, no scandals, just the rustle of paper, the curl of a ribbon, the sigh of memory. Close your eyes, dear listener. Let her gentle words carry you where dreams are soft, and time stands still. Sleep well, traveller. You are safe. You are loved. Sweet dreams. Marie Mancini, Louis's first true heartbreak. In a world stitched together by alliances and arranged destinies, she arrived not as a queen nor a mistress, but as something far more dangerous, the first woman the young Louis XIV ever truly loved. Her name was Marie Mancini, born in Rome in 1639, a child of Italian nobility whose life was shaped not by royal blood, but by connections that carried her across countries. Her uncle was Cardinal Mazarin, the powerful minister to the French king, and when she was still in her early teens, the cardinal brought her and her sisters to the glittering, uncertain world of the French court, a place ruled by silk, secrets, and ceremony. She was not the most beautiful of her sisters, not in the traditional sense. Her features were strong, her eyes deep and thoughtful, but there was something in her that shimmered quietly, an intensity, a quickness of mind, a curiosity that drew people in. She loved books. She listened when others only spoke, and soon, at the tender edge of womanhood, she caught the attention of the most unlikely heart, the young King of France. Louis XIV, golden and glowing with the divine aura of kingship, had grown up in a palace of rules, a boy whose emotions were guided more by duty than freedom. He had never been allowed to choose, not what to wear, not what to think, and certainly not whom to love. But when he met Marie, something inside him began to unravel gently, like a ribbon slipping from a braid. They spent time together in gardens and galleries, not hidden away, but in the open, surrounded by courtiers pretending not to see what was blooming. They spoke of poetry, of honour, of the future. He listened when she spoke of constellations and philosophy. She challenged him, softened him. She made him laugh, not the stiff, polite chuckle of a prince, but the real laugh of a boy who had never known that his heart was his own to give. And for a time, it seemed as though the impossible might be allowed. Louis spoke of marriage. He defied expectations. He imagined a world where love could outweigh alliance. But France was not built on dreams. France needed a queen, not a clever Italian girl with no crown of her own. The court grew tense. Whispers turned to warnings. Cardinal Mazarin, once her protector, now became her barrier. He knew that Louis's marriage was not just personal, it was political. The future of France could not be shaped by feeling. And so Marie was sent away. Not in disgrace, not in fury, but with the quiet, cold finality that power always demands. One morning, she left the palace where she'd once stood in sunlight beside the king, and she never returned. Her carriage rolled away beneath a pale sky. The king, they say, watched her go from a high window and did not speak for hours. She was only 20. Time moved on, as it always does. Louis married a Spanish princess. France rejoiced. The crown was secured, and yet, in the quiet places of his heart, the echo of Marie remained. He once said softly, "I loved her, but I am the king." Marie, far from Versailles, carried her heartbreak with grace. She travelled, she wrote, she married a nobleman, Prince Lorenzo Colonna, but their union was not one of passion or peace. It was a partnership of necessity, marked by distance and silence. In many ways, she remained a stranger in the court she entered, a woman whose story had been paused too soon. But she did not fade. Instead, she found strength in her solitude. She became a writer in a time when few women dared to lift a pen. She chronicled her life, not in bitterness, but with clarity and courage. Her memoir spoke of love, exile, longing, and identity. Through them, she carved her name into the memory of a world that had once tried to erase her. She lived not as a royal, but as a witness, a woman who had seen the sun at its height and walked calmly into the dusk. Her later years were spent in thought, in travel, and in memory. She did not return to France. She did not seek her king again. But in the pages of her words and in the quiet corners of history, their story endured. Marie Mancini died in 1715, just months before Louis XIV himself passed away. In the end, they belonged to the same era, separated by politics but joined by something gentler, a love that had no crown, no conclusion, but also no regret. Tonight, as sleep gathers like mist over your thoughts, picture her not as the forgotten girl or the abandoned lover, but as the woman who made a king feel human. See her walking beside a fountain, her hand trailing in the water, whispering lines of poetry to the night. The stars above her know her name, the wind still carries her voice. She was never queen, but she was loved, and sometimes that's the greater power. As you close your eyes, may her story of quiet strength lull your heart to rest. Sleep well, dear dreamer. Let love guide your breath, and may your dreams be soft. Olympia Mancini, ambitious niece of Cardinal Mazarin. She was born into shadows and stars, one of the many nieces of the powerful Cardinal Mazarin, yet, unlike the rest, Olympia Mancini came into the world with something wilder behind her eyes. Rome was her beginning, warm with oranges in bloom and marble palaces that whispered secrets. The year was 1638, and the world she entered was already filled with ambitions bigger than kingdoms. Her family was noble, but not royal. Her father, Baron Lorenzo Mancini, was an astrologer, gazing at the heavens for signs of favour or danger. Her mother, Geronima, was the sister of a cardinal who ruled France not with a sword, but with strategy. When her father died, and her mother sought new fortune, Olympia was swept from Italy to France along with her 5 sisters, collectively known as the Mazarinettes. The court of Louis XIV was a universe of its own, ruled not only by monarchs but by whispers, glances and gowns stitched with promises. Olympia, unlike her more modest sisters, took to this world like a spark takes to dry paper. Her beauty was bold, her laughter loud, her eyes sharp. She didn't just walk into a room, she claimed it. From the beginning it was clear. She would not be a background figure. Olympia longed for power, not in quiet domestic ways, but in grand golden strokes. She had wit, daring, and a charm that knew exactly when to show itself. It was not long before she caught the attention of Louis XIV himself, still a teenager, still learning the weight of his crown. The young king was drawn to her fire, her intellect, the way she teased him with half smiles and whole truths. But the flame between them, though it flickered, was never allowed to grow. Her uncle, Cardinal Mazarin, knew better than to let ambition and affection mingle too closely. France needed Louis to marry wisely. Olympia, passionate and impulsive, was too unpredictable. She could be close to power, but never at the centre of it. Instead, a marriage was arranged. She became the Countess of Soissons, the wife of Prince Eugene Maurice of Savoy. To many it seemed a victory. She had married well, stepped securely into the noble ranks of Europe. But Olympia did not seek comfort. She sought influence. And once she had children, 8 in all, including the famous Prince Eugene of Savoy, who would later carve his name into history through war and glory, she turned her eyes back toward the court of Versailles. She was not content to be a silent mother or a fading memory. She returned to court as a hostess, a connector, a woman whose salon buzzed with laughter, poetry, secrets, and political schemes. She was close to Queen Anne, warm with the nobility and well versed in the language of ambition. But power, as it often does, invites danger. It was during the height of her social reign that a shadow began to fall, a slow, creeping cloud called the Affair of the Poisons. In the glittering corridors of Versailles, whispers turned to accusations. Nobles were said to be dabbling in witchcraft and poisonings in black masses. The king launched investigations, and suddenly everything delicate turned deadly. Olympia's name was soon entangled in the scandal. It wasn't just her sharp tongue or sharp mind. It was her association with known fortune-tellers, her correspondence with figures later accused of terrible deeds. Rumours swirled. Had she poisoned rivals? Had she sought spells to advance her station? Had she once used magic to win a royal heart? No verdict ever passed against her, but suspicion was enough. She fled France in disgrace, abandoning the very court she had once so brightly illuminated. For the rest of her days, Olympia lived in exile, drifting between European cities like a fallen comet. She wrote, she waited, she pleaded, but Louis never allowed her to return. Still, she was never entirely broken. In her exile, she remained witty, proud, and fiercely intelligent. She saw her son rise in military ranks. She watched the world shift from the outside. Her later years were quieter, colder perhaps, but never silent. The fire that had burned in her youth now glowed more gently, like embers beneath velvet. Olympia Mancini died far from Versailles, far from the laughter and the chandeliers that had once reflected her face. She passed in 1708 at the age of 70 with dignity and distance. The France she had known had changed, but her name, scandalous, magnetic, unforgettable, remained written in its story. History remembers her with contradiction. A beauty, a schemer, a loyal mother, a rumoured sorceress, a political casualty. But if you close your eyes and breathe softly, you might see her as she was, a woman who refused to accept the place given to her, a woman who reached too high, perhaps, but only because she could see how high she might have soared. Tonight, as your thoughts grow quieter, let her story settle in your chest like the soft rustle of silk. Imagine her, still young, still bold, walking through a moonlit corridor, her fan half closed, her secrets pressed to her lips. The night around her is quiet, but her mind races with plans, dreams, possibilities. She was not born to sleep in comfort, but you are. So let her walk on, beyond the garden, into dreams that are hers no more. And now, dear dreamer, as your eyelids grow heavy, let Olympia's tale drift away like perfume in candlelight. You are safe, you are warm, sleep well, and sweet dreams. Madame Scanril governess turned Madame de Maintenon. The stars did not shine brightly over Françoise d'Aubigné when she was born in 1635. Her father, imprisoned for debt and schemes, cast long shadows across her childhood. She was brought into the world in a modest prison in Niort, her cradle not carved from privilege but from hardship and worry. Her mother, proud and Catholic, clung to propriety even as the family teetered on the edge of disgrace. And so little Françoise grew up between worlds, poor but noble, devout but exposed to mischief and instability. Her story would not begin in splendour, but it would end in quiet majesty. As a child, Françoise was sent to the West Indies when her father, released from prison, took up a colonial post. There, in the unfamiliar warmth of Martinique, she learned what it meant to be an outsider. Her skin burned under the Caribbean sun. She absorbed strange languages, strange foods, and the even stranger rhythms of a world built on trade and power. When her father died, she returned to France, alone, half foreign, and once again without comfort. She lived with relatives, passed between households like a parcel wrapped in expectations. She was too poor to be sought after and too proud to be pitied. Eventually her family married her off to Paul Scarron, a crippled, eccentric poet nearly 3 decades older. He was witty, biting, often cruel in humour, but his literary connections gave Françoise a rare entry into the circles of intellect and power. As his wife, she learned to navigate salons, to speak cleverly without threatening, to dress modestly yet with grace. But when he died, she was left again in uncertainty. Now a widow, she was neither rich nor young by courtly standards, and yet something about her lingered, something poised, something quietly magnetic. It was then that her true path began. Cardinal Mazarin and Anne of Austria took note of her discretion and intelligence. She was offered the position of governess to the illegitimate children of King Louis XIV and Madame de Montespan. Many women would have refused the post. It was dangerous, deeply political, and laced with scandal, but Françoise accepted. She moved into the hidden estate of Maintenon, raising royal children in quiet halls, teaching them not only to read and write, but to think kindly, to walk with humility, to speak with clarity. The king began to hear of her from his children, this calm, composed woman with eyes like dusk and a voice that never rose above a whisper. And soon he wished to meet her himself. What began as formal admiration turned ever so slowly into something deeper. Françoise was not like the king's mistresses. She did not flirt. She did not parade herself in silk and jewels. She offered advice. She listened. She prayed. She soothed. In a court ruled by glitter and noise, her silence was golden. And as Madame de Montespan fell from favour, tarnished by the affair of the poisons and her own fiery pride, Françoise stepped into the spaces she left behind, not with triumph, but with careful, measured grace. The king began visiting her more often. Their conversations stretched into the night. She spoke of duty, of faith, of redemption. He, so long surrounded by flatterers, found peace in her presence. And then, in the secrecy of a chapel, it happened. They married. No public announcement, no crown, no parade. But it was a marriage nonetheless, a morganatic union where Françoise would never be queen, though she was now the king's lawful wife. The court buzzed with speculation, but nothing was ever officially confirmed. She became known as Madame de Maintenon after the estate Louis had gifted her, and in that name she carried power cloaked in modesty. She used her influence not for personal gain, but for reform. She encouraged the king toward piety. She helped found Saint-Cyr, a school for girls of noble but impoverished families. She worked quietly to temper the harsher policies of Louis's reign, especially as he aged. Some saw her as a saint, others as a manipulator cloaked in virtue, but always she remained calm. Over the years she witnessed the glory and decline of Versailles. She saw the long wars, the death of heirs, the shift in winds that once favoured absolute power. She was there when the king wept for his lost son. She was there when his steps grew slower, his eyes dimmer. She prayed beside him when his health failed, and she held his hand through long nights of silence. When Louis XIV died in 1715, Françoise did not cling to the last embers of power. She withdrew to Saint-Cyr, the school she had built, where she lived the rest of her life in simplicity. There, surrounded by young girls reciting poetry and practicing penmanship, she found the peace that had long eluded her. She died in 1719, 4 years after the Sun King. No bells tolled in Versailles. But in the school halls of Saint-Cyr her name was whispered with affection and reverence. And so, tonight as your body begins to sink into the softness of sleep, remember Françoise not as a mere governess, not even as the hidden wife of a king, but as a woman who rose from the margins with quiet strength. She needed no crown, no thunderous applause. She was a lantern in a palace of chandeliers, small, steady, enduring. Picture her now, in a quiet room lit by candlelight, writing in a journal as children sleep nearby. Her face is older, lined with years, but still composed. Her hands, once folded in prayer, rest gently in her lap. Outside, the world keeps spinning, but inside, in the hush of night, all is calm. And you, dear dreamer, are safe to rest as she once did, finally free of masks, of courts, of weighty roles. Just you, breathing, drifting, surrounded by softness. As you close your eyes tonight, let Françoise's gentle wisdom carry you into still waters. Sleep well, dear traveller of time. Sweet dreams. Duchess of Orleans, Charlotte Elizabeth. Foreign princess with a sharp wit. She arrived in France not as a queen, but as a stranger, wrapped in furs, speaking a language foreign to the French court, her steps echoing through marble halls that did not welcome easily. Her name was Charlotte Elizabeth of the Palatinate, a princess by birth, but in her eyes there shimmered no dreams of fairy tale royalty, only the cold clarity of a girl who understood, even in her youth, that courts were places of masks and silences. She had been born in Heidelberg in 1652 into a world shaped by war and ruin. Her father, Charles Louis, Elector Palatine, ruled over a region still trembling from the devastation of the 30 Years' War. Her mother, Charlotte of Hesse-Kassel, was stern and reserved. The young Charlotte Elizabeth, nicknamed Liselotte, learned early the value of restraint, but she also possessed a biting wit, a brilliant memory, and a deeply stubborn heart. Even as a child, she spoke her mind with unblinking honesty, and when she laughed loudly. She was not considered a great beauty, but she was solid, healthy, and clever. And when the French king, Louis XIV, sought a bride for his brother Philippe, Duke of Orleans, it was Liselotte he chose, partly for political alliance, partly because she came with little threat of ambition. She was Protestant when she arrived, though she would convert, and with her arrival, a new chapter quietly unfolded at Versailles. Married at 17, Charlotte Elizabeth stepped into a world that dazzled and suffocated. Versailles was not like Heidelberg. Here, jewels whispered power and smiles could slice like blades. Her husband Philippe, brother to the king, was flamboyant, vain, and entirely indifferent to her affections. He preferred his male companions, especially the dashing Chevalier de Lorraine, and Charlotte Elizabeth, blunt and unpolished by court standards, was quickly marginalized. Yet she did not wilt. She observed. She observed everything. In her early days at court, she struggled. She missed Germany, the open skies, the honest conversations. Her letters, thousands of them over the years, were full of homesickness and sharp humour. She called Versailles a theatre where everyone wore masks. She noted the pettiness, the gossip, the ever-shifting alliances, and in that golden cage she found freedom not through power, but through her pen. Time softened her edges, though it never dulled her mind. She bore children, 3 who lived beyond infancy. Her son, the future regent of France, would go on to lead the nation during the childhood of Louis XV. And while her husband kept his own private court, Charlotte Elizabeth carved out a space for herself, not through seduction or manipulation, but through authenticity. She wrote letters nearly every day, honest, often humorous, sometimes caustic, always observant. She wrote to her half-sister, to friends in Germany, to strangers who would become confidants. Her words formed a web across Europe. As the years passed, she grew into her role as Duchess of Orleans. She never became a central figure in the inner court, but she became something rarer, a voice unafraid of truth. While others flattered, she commented with dry wit. While others plotted, she retreated to her own apartments to write. She kept close to her children, took long walks in the gardens, and found companionship in books and conversation. There came a time when her husband's affections cooled further, and the court moved on to newer intrigues. Madame de Maintenon rose beside the king in silent power. Mistresses fell and rose again. Wars came and went, and Charlotte Elizabeth remained, like a steady, unsentimental clock chiming behind a curtain. She watched Louis XIV age into rigidity and religious fervour, watched Philippe withdraw from public life, and lived long enough to see both pass away. Her life was not without sorrow. Her daughter died young, her son caused her worry with his indulgent lifestyle. She suffered illnesses and periods of isolation, and yet, through it all, she kept writing. Each page she penned was filled with dry observations, personal reflections, and a tenderness that peeked through even her most biting critiques. She had no illusions about court life. She knew she had been married off to serve a political purpose. She knew that love in her world was often a performance. But she also found moments of real affection with her children, her friends, and perhaps most of all, in the privacy of her thoughts. Her letters were never meant for public reading, and yet today they remain one of the richest records of life at Versailles, not through grandeur, but through honesty. In her later years, Charlotte Elizabeth moved between Versailles, the Palais Royal, and the countryside. She became a grandmother, a respected matron, and a quiet presence in an ever-shifting world. She died in 1722 at the age of 70, having lived through some of the most dazzling and devastating decades of French history. Her legacy is not cast in marble. It does not hang in the hall of mirrors or echo in the anthems of state. It exists in ink, in thousands of pages written by hand, filled with laughter, loneliness, and razor-sharp truth. She gave us not the myth of Versailles, but its heartbeat. And now, as the hush of night deepens around you, picture her sitting at her desk near a flickering candle. Outside, the fountains are quiet. The court has long gone to sleep, but she still writes, her pen moving steadily, her face illuminated by golden firelight. The words she writes are not for fame or favour, but because they must be said. Tonight her voice drifts softly across time to find you. Let it lull you. Let it comfort you. Let it remind you that even in the most glittering prisons one can still find a way to speak. As you lay your head down, let Charlotte Elizabeth's quiet defiance, gentle humour carry you into sleep. You're safe now. You're at peace. Sleep well, dear dreamer, sweet dreams. Mademoiselle de la Motte, dreamer manipulated in court games. She was born not in luxury, but in shadows. Jeanne de Valois-Saint-Remy, who would later be known as Mademoiselle de la Motte, entered the world in 1756 in the quiet region of Champagne. Her lineage was ancient. She was a descendant of the Valois kings of France, but her cradle was worn, her family poor. They were noble in name, but not in coin. Her father drank, her mother despaired, and their once proud bloodline had thinned into desperation. As a child, Jeanne wandered through the countryside dreaming of the golden halls, of silk gowns, of whispers in candlelit corridors. Her imagination became her escape. She believed she was destined for something greater. Her mother, strict and weary, tried to root her in reality, but Jeanne's gaze often floated past the horizon toward a palace she had never seen. The world outside her dreams was less kind. After her parents died, she was left to fend for herself. She moved from home to home, always claiming her noble lineage, always hoping someone would believe in her enough to offer assistance. The church gave her some support, and she eventually married a man named Marc-Antoine Nicolas de la Motte, who, like her, dreamed more than he acted. Together they tried to carve a path through Paris. They wore borrowed clothes, spoke in refined tones, and whispered of royal blood. Jeanne was clever. She had a gift for performance, for persuasion, for making her stories feel like truth. And in the tangled world of Versailles, where masks were currency and illusion was often mistaken for charm, she found a fragile place for herself. She told anyone who would listen that she was a Valois, that she had been wronged, that the court owed her something, and slowly, bit by bit, people began to listen. Her rise came through proximity, through cunning, through carefully chosen friends. Among the courtiers and cardinals, she met those hungry for power, for favour, for secrets. She spun a tale around herself, half truth, half lie, all woven with the confidence of a born storyteller. But it was when she encountered the ambitious Cardinal de Rohan that the strands began to tighten. He was wealthy, eager to return to favour with Queen Marie Antoinette, and Jeanne, always sensing what others needed most, promised him what he longed for, a path back to the Queen's heart. She told him she could help, that the Queen trusted her, that there were ways, discreet letters, quiet meetings, midnight gardens. Rohan, flattered and blind to caution, believed her. Jeanne crafted letters forged in delicate script. She arranged a secret meeting in the gardens of Versailles, using a woman resembling the Queen to complete the illusion. And most daring of all, she convinced him to purchase an extravagant diamond necklace worth millions, believing it was for the Queen and that his name would soon be restored. But the dream unravelled. The Queen had never ordered the necklace. The King had never known, and when the truth surfaced, it burst like thunder through the court. The affair of the diamond necklace, as it would be called, became one of the most infamous scandals of the 18th century. Jeanne was arrested, tried. paraded through the streets of Paris. For a time she clung to her lies. She smiled for the crowds. She defended herself with passion. But eventually the weight of her schemes collapsed around her. She was sentenced to prison and publicly whipped. Though the marks faded, the shame lingered. And yet, even after her fall, she never stopped believing she had been wronged. She escaped from prison dressed as a boy. She fled to London, where she published memoirs filled with defiance. She painted herself as the victim, the pawn, the misunderstood heroine. And in a way, perhaps she was. She died young, in 1791, under mysterious circumstances. Some say she fell from a window, others whisper darker endings. But what remains is the sense of a woman who never let go of her dream, even when it led her into ruin. Jeanne was not a villain in the usual sense. She harmed with stories, not swords. She deceived not out of cruelty, but out of longing for a place, a name, a life she had been denied. In her mind, she was not lying. She was correcting an injustice. The world had forgotten her noble blood, and she had simply reminded it, using the tools she had: charm, illusion, hope. Her tale, as it echoed through salons and courtrooms, did more than stain reputations. It eroded trust in the monarchy. It fueled whispers that the queen was careless, that the court was corrupt, that the divide between rich and poor had become unbearable. Her actions, born of longing, would help tip the scales toward revolution. But tonight, as the world sleeps and history grows quiet, we look not at the scandal, but at the girl from Champagne who gazed at the stars and believed she belonged among them. Picture her now, walking alone through a moonlit garden, not Versailles, but one of her imagining. The air is soft. The path winds gently through roses and trimmed hedges. She wears a gown made not of silk, but of memory. Around her, the night hums with peace. No whispers, no judges, no fear. She smiles. She knows at last no one can take her dreams away. And you, dear dreamer, lying now in your own quiet room, let go, just as she once did. Let your thoughts drift into a gentler place, a place where stories bloom, where sorrow fades, where illusions become comfort. As you close your eyes tonight, let Jeanne's dream-touched tale guide you gently into slumber. Sleep well, dear traveller of time, sweet dreams. Mademoiselle Desouillet. Montespan's maid and secret keeper. Her name was Claude de Vin, though history remembers her by a gentler title, Mademoiselle d'Elle Ouillet, of the Carnations. Not royalty, not a noblewoman, just a quiet figure who passed behind the grand mirrors of Versailles, unseen by the spotlight but close, so very close to the fire. She didn't wear diamonds, she carried secrets. She was born sometime around 1637, far from the perfumes and painted ceilings of court, the daughter of an actor in the travelling theatre troupes of France. Her childhood was woven with the sounds of applause and the scent of worn velvet costumes. She grew up backstage behind curtains, where actors whispered their lines and painters touched up aging scenery. Perhaps she learned early that the world was built on illusion, and that to survive one must know when to smile and when to vanish. Her mother died while Claude was still young, and though her father did what he could, the world wasn't soft for a girl without connections, but Claude was clever and quiet, and she watched everything. While the others danced in front of audiences, she memorized the way power moved, not in monologues, but in glances and in timing, in silence. Eventually she made her way to Paris. There, in the glistening web of nobility, she found work with Madame de Montespan, a woman ascending fast, whose beauty and wit had caught the eye of the most powerful man in France, Louis XIV. To be her maid, her shadow, was to stand at the very edge of fire. At first, Claude simply did what was asked, dressing, fetching, assisting. But Montespan was not an easy mistress. She demanded loyalty, perfection, and unwavering discretion. Claude gave all three. She moved with grace, spoke only when necessary, and never betrayed the secrets she overheard. And slowly her role shifted. She became not just a servant, but a confidant. The court glittered. Versailles echoed with laughter and intrigue. Montespan dazzled the king, and Claude, always close, always watching, held her place with stillness. She learned when to look away and when to listen. She never asked questions, but she always had answers. She kept appointments, delivered letters, soothed tempers, arranged meetings. Montespan trusted her with everything, even with her most fragile fears. But power is a fickle thing. As Madame de Montespan's influence grew, so too did the envy and suspicion around her. Whispers began, of jealousy, of dark rituals, of shadowy figures offering spells and poisons in exchange for favour. And into this cloud stepped a name the court would never forget. Lavoisin, the fortune-teller, the poisoner, the priestess of the forbidden. Montespan, fearing she would lose the king's affection, had begun seeking darker methods to hold on to him. It was said that she'd visited Lavoisin, that rituals had been performed, that black masses had been whispered beneath the candlelight, and through it all Claude stood by her side, faithful, silent, trembling. It is said that Desnoyers attended some of these gatherings, that she brought messages, that she passed the powder from hand to hand. She never confessed publicly, but when the affair of the poisons broke, an explosive scandal that shook every wall of Versailles, her name appeared on the lists. She was questioned, detained, observed, but no definitive proof was ever found. Perhaps the secrets she kept were locked too deep, even for the king's judges. Still, the damage was done. Though Montespan would never regain her former glory, Claude remained close to her. She did not abandon her mistress. She did not run when it became dangerous to be associated. While others turned away, Claude stayed, always behind, always silent, and yet not untouched. During those tangled years of scandal and superstition, she had become entangled in something far more delicate than politics. She had a child, a daughter, born not to a faceless suitor, but, so many believed, to Louis XIV himself. There were rumours, soft ones never spoken too loudly, that during Montespan's pregnancies or quarrels, the king had found brief comfort in des Oeillet, that she too had known his warmth, that from their union came a Guerre Louise de Maison Blanche, a name that would never be recognised at court. But Claude did not demand acknowledgement. She did not push her daughter forward. She did what she had always done, protected in silence. She raised the child far from the palace. No royal title, no gold-embroidered gowns, just quiet care, far from Versailles. Her later years were spent in the shadows. Montespan fell from favour. New mistresses took her place. The corridors once alive with presence dimmed with the echo of footsteps that no longer mattered. And Claude, too, receded. She passed away in 1687. No monuments were raised. No portraits hung in golden frames. No grand eulogies were spoken at court. And yet her presence lingers, in the margins of memoirs, in the footnotes of letters, in the strange hush around certain names. Claude Devin, Mademoiselle de Oeillet, was not a queen. She was not noble. She made no speeches, led no armies, signed no treaties. But she lived at the very heart of power and carried some of the deepest secrets Versailles ever held. And now, as the noise of the court fades to stillness, and your room settles into the hush of night, let her presence drift softly to you. Imagine her lighting a candle in a small room, hands steady, eyes calm. A world of silk and mirrors may dance outside her door, but within there is only peace. She was the quiet watcher, the loyal shadow, the keeper of all that was never meant to be known. And though history passes her name by, tonight she is remembered, in silence, in moonlight, in dreams. As you close your eyes tonight, may the soft strength of Mademoiselle de Waillet cradle your thoughts like candlelight. Sleep well, dear dreamer of forgotten names. Sweet dreams. Madame de Brinvilliers, dark alchemist figure. Poison affair. She was born into a world of polished silver and flickering candles, of quiet ambition and watchful silence. Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray, who would later be known as Madame de Brinvilliers, entered life in 1630s Paris as the daughter of a respected magistrate. Her home was one of solemn dignity, where words mattered and secrets rarely slept. From an early age, Marie-Madeleine moved like someone who understood that the world could shift with a whisper. Her father, stern and proud, ensured his children were educated, well-mannered and obedient. But young Marie had a gaze that lingered, curious, perhaps too curious. Behind her soft eyes and delicate demeanour was a mind that questioned rules, a spirit that leaned toward the hidden corners of things. She was married young, as most women of her standing were. Her husband, the Marquis de Brinvilliers, was a man of good title, a soldier with charm and an adventurous heart. But like many marriages of the courtly world, theirs was not built on affection. He gambled, he drank, he drifted, and Marie, left alone in grand rooms with mirrors and shadows, began to feel the cold edges of loneliness. To fill that quiet, she turned first to books, then to confidences, and finally to companionship. It was during this quiet turning that she met Gaudin de Sainte-Croix, a man who would become both her closest friend and in time her undoing. He was clever, charming, with just enough danger in his smile to make the air around him feel warmer. Marie, drawn to that warmth, leaned into it, and with him the world began to change. Sainte-Croix was not like her husband. He listened, he shared, and he had connections, to apothecaries, to alchemists, to those who knew the quiet languages of powders and vials. Marie, once a magistrate's daughter and a nobleman's wife, found herself drawn into a subtler realm, one where the balance of a drop could decide fate. Her heart may have begun the journey out of longing, but something darker, quieter, settled in with time. It started small, a tonic for sleeplessness, a draught to quiet worry, but as her trust in Sainte-Croix deepened, so too did her knowledge of what could be done with the right ingredients. Their bond grew stronger, hidden behind curtained windows and private letters. She learned to mix things, gentle at first, almost innocent. But then came tragedy, one that turned her thoughts more inward. Her father, the magistrate, had disapproved of her affair, disapproved of Sainte-Croix, and perhaps, in her view, disapproved of her entirely. When he died suddenly after an unexplained illness, no one raised a hand in suspicion. But Marie had watched him suffer, and there are tales, soft, speculative tales, that suggest she did more than watch. The years that followed became heavy with loss. A brother died, then another, and then her sister. The family she'd grown up with began to vanish, one by one. Their deaths, like her father's, seemed tragic but natural. Illness, bad luck, fragile health. Paris mourned, but it did not question. And through it all, Marie walked quietly, with hands folded and eyes lowered. But the court had ears. The affair of the poisons, as it would come to be known, began to stir. Names were whispered in the corridors of Versailles, names of women, many noble, who are said to have dabbled in the darker arts, potions, powders, prayers to things not mentioned in sunlight. When Sainte-Croix died suddenly, and among his belongings were found letters with Marie's name, her world, once so delicately arranged, began to tremble. She fled, disguised, quietly. From city to city she moved, changing her name, staying in cloisters, speaking little. But the weight of what she carried and the reach of those who pursued her could not be escaped forever. She was eventually captured and brought back to Paris. There was no grand trial, No loud declaration. What followed was slow, meticulous, inevitable. The authorities questioned her gently at first, then with more pressure. She denied. She wept. But the story was already moving without her. She had become in their eyes a symbol of secret crimes, a noblewoman who had hidden too much for too long. She died in 1676. The court did not mourn her, not openly. The king made no mention. Versailles moved on. And yet, her story lingered. Not because of the crimes, not because of the whispers or the fear, but because of the quiet sadness behind it all. A woman born into a world that gave her everything but love, a life that promised silk and gave silence, a heart that sought comfort and found shadow. Perhaps she never meant for things to go as far as they did. Perhaps she simply followed one wrong step with another, until the path behind her was too far gone. Tonight, though, we leave the scandals behind. Let us imagine Marie in a soft garden, far from court. The moon above her, silver and wide, the sky brushed with gentle stars. She walks barefoot on the grass, each step lighter than the last. There is no fear, no chase, no guilt, just the sound of wind through leaves and the warmth of a summer night. In her hands she holds not vials or scrolls, but carnations, the flower she once pressed into her childhood books. She remembers a time when her world was simple, when the questions in her heart were only about stars and stories, not survival, and in this imagined place where dreams soften history, she smiles. Sleep now, dear dreamer. Let go of the world and its heavy names. There is no need to judge, only to breathe, to rest, to drift. As you close your eyes tonight, let the soft hush of Marie's forgotten path cradle you like the petals of a bloom long faded. Sleep well, dear listener. Sweet dreams. Louise de Querouaille, French spy in English court. She was born beside the sea, where salt clung to the wind and the waves whispered like secrets against the shore. Louise de Querouaille, daughter of a Breton noble family, came into the world around 1649 with eyes as watchful as the tide. Her family had status, but not grandeur. Her world was one of noble modesty, manor halls, cold stone floors, and the distant echoes of war and politics far from their estate. But Louise always listened to the winds, and the winds, it seemed, carried her far from home. From an early age, Louise knew how to wait. She was not loud or bold, but patient and observing. She studied etiquette like scripture, practiced her curtsies in quiet halls, and dreamed of life beyond Brittany, of silks, candles, and royal palaces glowing like lanterns in the fog. And her time came when she was chosen to serve in the household of Henrietta of England, sister to King Charles II of England, and sister-in-law to the French king, Louis XIV. Henrietta was a bridge between two kingdoms, a woman fluent in the language of diplomacy and affection, and Louise became her lady-in-waiting. In the bright gardens and shaded salons of Henrietta's world, Louise learned to move like the court, graceful, composed, and watchful. She heard everything, but rarely spoke out of turn. Her beauty was delicate. Pale skin, dark eyes, a thoughtful stillness that made people pause and look again. She carried mystery like perfume. It was during one of Henrietta's visits to England that Louise first caught the eye of King Charles II. He, the merry monarch, known for his wit and wandering heart, saw in her something different. She was not flirtatious like the women of his court, not bold or brash. She was composed, and it intrigued him. Their connection began as a spark behind courtesies, a shared glance, a soft smile, and soon it deepened into something far more intimate. When Henrietta died suddenly, her household scattered, and many believed Louise would return to France. But she remained, not by accident, not entirely by choice either. France had seen an opportunity. King Louis XIV, ever strategic, believed that having someone close to Charles II could serve his cause, and who better than Louise? Loyal, elegant, and already favoured by the English king. So she stayed in England, and Charles made her his mistress. He gave her a title, Duchess of Portsmouth, and with it a position at court that few could challenge. She had rooms at Whitehall, servants of her own, and jewels that shimmered like stars. But what sparkled outside often hid deeper storms. Many in England saw her not just as a mistress, but as an outsider, a Catholic, and worse, a French spy. And perhaps she was, in her own quiet way. She sent letters, received packages, passed messages with the elegance of a glance. But hers was not the world of daggers and cloaks. It was diplomacy threaded through silk and wine, through pillow talk and soft petitions. She used affection as others used swords, and she rarely missed her mark. Her relationship with Charles lasted for years. Unlike his other lovers, she did not seek drama or scandal. She kept her composure even when insulted, even when the whispers grew loud. She bore the criticism, the anti-Catholic sentiment, the distrust of Parliament, and she endured with patience, understanding that her strength lay in stillness. But power always shifts. As Charles aged, his attention wandered, and though Louise remained close, she saw the decline before others admitted it. She had borne him a son, Charles Lennox, whom the king acknowledged and treated with affection. But the court was changing. The politics grew colder. Her influence, once like warm sunlight, began to dim. When Charles died in 1685, Louise was left exposed. Her protector, her royal anchor, was gone, and the new winds at court were not kind. She had wealth, yes, and a son with royal blood. But she no longer had a voice in the rooms where decisions were made. She remained in England for a time, clinging to what remnants of her world she could preserve. But eventually the tide pulled her back to France. There, she lived in a strange half-shadow, wealthy, titled, but no longer relevant. She withdrew from the games of court, spending her days with books, her son, and the silence that always finds those who once stood too close to power. The French court remembered her, but not kindly, and England forgot her entirely, except as a name whispered in tales of spies and silken deception. But beneath it all, Louise had always remained one thing: composed. Through the rise and fall of fortunes, through public suspicion and private sorrow, she never lost her quiet dignity. She had played the game not with noise, but with grace, not with ambition, but with a patient sense of timing. And in her quiet retreat, far from the laughter of Whitehall, perhaps she found peace. Tonight let her story settle gently in your thoughts, not as a tale of scandal, but as a soft sketch of a woman who navigated two worlds with care. She was neither villain nor saint. She was simply observant, a woman who moved between kings and nations, who wore her mask without malice, who loved in shadows and survived in silence. Let the rustle of her gown fade into the breeze. Let the candles dim in the hallway behind her. She's walking now in gardens no longer watched, her hands folded, her mind quiet. She smiles softly, not because she has won or lost, but because the performance is over. The stage is empty, and in the hush that follows there is only the sea again, and the wind. As you close your eyes tonight, may Louise's quiet strength wrap around you like a velvet cloak. Sleep gently, dream sweetly, and rest in the hush between the waves of time. Madame de Caylus-Witty, gossip-loving noblewoman. The air of Versailles was always thick with perfume and secrets, and through its golden corridors walked a woman with laughter in her voice and ink on her fingers. Marthe Marguerite de Villette de Mercier, who would later be known as Madame de Caylus, was not a queen, nor a great beauty of legend, but hers was a name that lingered in conversations like the aftertaste of a clever joke. She was born in 1673 into a family with connections that mattered, close to the court, tied to nobility, and firmly planted in the world of polished etiquette and whispered gossip. From childhood, Marthe was quick with words and quicker still with her eyes. She noticed everything. The way someone's tone shifted when speaking to a duke, the subtle flick of a fan when discomfort passed through a room, the hesitation behind a compliment. She was a girl who did not just learn the dance of court. She studied its rhythm, memorized its silences, and carried it all with an elegant smirk. Her early life was shaped by one woman in particular, Madame de Maintenon, second wife of Louis XIV, who took Marthe under her wing like a favoured niece. At the Maison Royale de Saint-Louis, a school Maintenon had founded for girls of noble birth, young Marthe absorbed lessons not just of literature and virtue, but of the court itself. She was groomed not for grandeur, but for observance, trained to watch the world and write it down. When she came of age, she entered the court of Versailles not as an ornament, but as a listener. She married Anne de Tubieres, Marquis de Caylus, a man of fine lineage but not loud presence. Their marriage, like many of the age, was a matter of station rather than affection. But Marthe seemed unaffected. She did not need the warmth of a passionate husband to thrive. Her real marriage was to the salon, the court, and the stories that bloomed like flowers beneath the chandeliers. She became a favourite in the company of queens, duchesses, and dames d'honneur. Her wit was celebrated, but never cruel, sharp enough to amuse, never to wound. She laughed at absurdity, but never betrayed. And perhaps that is why people trusted her, why they leaned in when she recounted the happenings of the court, why they let their secrets tumble out in her presence like pearls falling from a broken string. And through all of this, she wrote. Quietly, in the background of balls and banquets, she took note of everything, how the king aged, how courtiers fell in and out of favour, how Madame de Montespan's perfume lingered even after her shadow had passed. Her memory was a library, her pen discreet and unhurried, and though her observations would only be published long after her time, they were no less rich, no less vivid than the tapestries hanging on Versailles' walls. But her life was not simply a collection of clever lines and remembered scandals. Like many women of her time, Marthe lived through the subtle turbulence of fading influence. As Louis XIV grew older and the court began to lose some of its shimmering facade, so too did many of its players retreat from the stage. Madame de Maintenon, once all-powerful in her quiet way, stepped back into the shadows, and Marthe, once among the brightest voices in the salon, found herself wrapped in a gentler sort of silence. Her later years were marked by reflection more than revelry. She continued to write, not for kings, not for court approval, but for herself and those who might one day wish to remember what it had all been like. The powdered wigs, the secret pregnancies, the glances across the hall, the way Versailles looked at dawn before the mirrors caught fire in the rising sun. Illness visited her in time, as it does all who linger too long in the quiet, but she bore it with grace, just as she had borne all things, with a steady pen and a composed expression. When she died in 1729, she was no longer the witty young woman flitting between gossip and grace, but a quiet chronicler of a world slowly dissolving into memory. Her writings, though not published until decades later, became a window through which others would glimpse the intimate workings of a court so often drowned in grandeur. They were not bitter nor vengeful. They carried warmth, affection, and a kind of amused melancholy. She wrote of kings as men, of mistresses as women caught in impossible games, of courtiers as players dancing for survival beneath the gilded dome of power. And that is why she's remembered, not as a noble, not as a scandal, but as a voice. A quiet voice tucked into letters and pages that lets us see the sunlit gardens and golden staircases not just as grand structures, but as places where real people sighed, hoped, wept, and whispered. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine her in one of those rooms, curtains drawn, candlelight flickering, and the hush of evening settling like a shawl over her shoulders. She sits at a desk, a letter half written before her, the quill in her hand motionless as she stares into thought. Outside, the fountains murmur in the moonlight. The court, for once, is silent. She smiles, not because the words are finished, but because the night is kind and she has time. Let your breath slow now. Let the rustle of silk fade, and the echoes of her laughter become softer than wind through lace. There are no secrets tonight, no sharp words, only the gentle rhythm of a woman who once watched everything and told it all in kindness. As you drift into sleep, let the laughter of Martha de Caylus guide you through moonlit salons of memory. Rest now, dream sweetly, and may wit and grace find you in slumber. Cardinal Mazarin Louis is mentor and kingmaker. He was not born into velvet or crowned halls. Instead, he came into the world in the soft warmth of Pescara, in the Abruzzo region of Italy, in 1602, far from the courts of France, far from power. His name was Giulio Raimondo Mazzarino, and he would one day be known as Cardinal Mazarin the Kingmaker, the guardian of a crown and the quiet architect of a nation's future. But in the beginning, he was simply a clever boy with a gaze that missed nothing and a tongue fluent in charm. His family was noble, but not powerful. There were debts, responsibilities, and the deep hum of ambition woven into their every decision. Young Giulio was sent to the Jesuit college in Rome, where his quick wit and careful speech caught attention. He absorbed not just theology and Latin, but something deeper: how to watch a room, how to read silences, how to balance flattery with truth. These would become the skills that defined him more than any scripture. The church took note, so did France, and when he entered the service of the papal nuncio and later moved into French diplomacy, Mazarin's ascent began. His presence was never overwhelming. He didn't thunder like generals or shine like princes, but it was constant, persuasive, magnetic in its gentleness. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, even kings leaned closer. France at the time was fragile. Cardinal Richelieu had ruled with brilliance and severity, shaping the kingdom into a modern state. But his death in 1642 left a space no one dared fill. No one, except Mazarin. He became the chief minister of France under King Louis XIII, but when that king died shortly after, Mazarin was left in a far more delicate position. A boy king, Louis XIV, just 5 years old, a grieving queen, Anne of Austria, suddenly regent, and Mazarin by her side, a confidant perhaps more. The court whispered, was he her lover? Her secret husband? None could say for certain, and Mazarin, ever silent, never confirmed or denied. He simply worked. Through rebellion and chaos, he stayed near the young Louis. The Fronde, a series of noble uprisings against royal authority, could have torn France apart, but Mazarin managed to outlast it all, not with swords, but with patience, negotiation, and the occasional exile. He taught Louis not just to rule, but to understand. He brought him to councils, explained diplomacy in the quiet corners of palaces, offered not grand lessons, but simple ones, repeated with care. The boy grew into a man who trusted deeply in Mazarin's judgment, even as he slowly began to shape a will of his own. Mazarin became powerful, more powerful than some kings. He amassed wealth, negotiated treaties, and strengthened France's position in Europe. His greatest triumph was the Treaty of the Pyrenees, which not only ended war with Spain, but also secured a marriage alliance between Louis XIV and Maria Theresa of Spain. But power, even when earned gently, carries a cost. Mazarin was never fully accepted by the French nobility. To them, he was always the Italian, the foreigner, the priest without a pulpit who somehow held the reins of the kingdom. Satirists mocked him, pamphlets cursed his name, and the people, wearied by war and taxes, often blamed him for their troubles. Still, he smiled. Still, he endured. And quietly, always he kept shaping the future. His health declined slowly, as though time itself was reluctant to take him. In his final years, he looked around the court he'd helped build, saw the splendour growing, saw Louis rising into a monarch of his own mind. And perhaps he knew then that he would not be remembered for flamboyance or brilliance, but for one quiet thing, preparing France for what would come next. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis XIV stood on the edge of absolute power. He had learned from the man who ruled softly, and now he would rule with splendour. The Sun King was ready. Mazarin left behind not just a kingdom piece, but institutions, a centralised state, and a king who no longer needed a guardian. In his private quarters he'd collected art, letters and jewels, but perhaps his most enduring legacy was the stability he provided in an age that had teetered toward chaos. He had never worn a crown, but his influence flowed through marble halls like perfume. He had not fathered children, but in Louis he had shaped a ruler, and though he was often dismissed as a schemer, in truth Mazarin had simply understood the value of time, of silence, of holding back just enough to be underestimated. Until it was too late. Tonight, if you imagine him, not the cardinal in crimson robes, not the statesman at treaty tables, but the older man in his study, writing letters by candlelight, you'll see the real Mazarin, a mind that never slept, a soul always at the edge of prayer and politics, a man who watched others burn for glory and chose instead the gentle strength of influence. Let your breath slow. Let the echo of his footsteps fade down long corridors of Versailles. The halls are quiet now. His presence lingers, not loud but certain, like the memory of a whisper. As sleep folds over you, let the quiet wisdom of Mazarin cradle your thoughts. Rest deeply, dear dreamer, and drift on the soft winds of diplomacy and dusk. Sleep well. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the King's loyal Minister of Finance. He was not born into the shimmer of nobility or the echo of ancient names. He came from cloth, quite literally. In 1619, Jean-Baptiste Colbert entered the world in Reims, France, the son of a family of merchants who sold fine fabrics. No golden cradle, no castle windows, just ledgers, bolts of wool and the language of trade spoken over dinner tables. But in that modest beginning, the foundation of something far greater was quietly laid. From a young age, Jean-Baptiste displayed a mind not stirred by poetry or swordplay, but by numbers. He saw beauty in balance sheets, harmony in efficient systems, and a sort of music in regulation. While other boys might have dreamed of galloping off to war or winning the favour of court ladies, young Colbert dreamed of solving how to make things work better, faster, smoother. He was sent to Paris to learn commerce, law, and the workings of bureaucracy. There, he entered the service of Michel Letellier, a trusted adviser to Cardinal Mazarin. And so, like a careful thread being woven into a grand tapestry, Colbert found his place in the heart of France's power. Mazarin noticed him. Not for flamboyance. Colbert had none of that. Not for charm. He wasn't particularly social. But for precision, loyalty, and the rare ability to see the full map while adjusting every cog within the machine. He rose, slowly and surely, trusted with greater responsibility. By the time Mazarin fell ill, and the boy king Louis XIV prepared to rule on his own, Colbert had already proved indispensable. When the king came into his full power in 1661, something unusual happened. Instead of being swept aside by favourites or war generals, Colbert was brought closer. Louis saw in him not just a servant of the crown, but a man who could help transform a dream of absolute monarchy into a functioning reality. Colbert became Controller General of Finances, a title that barely begins to hint at the scope of what he would manage. France was in debt, tangled in the remnants of war and waste. But Colbert did not flinch. He combed through accounts like a tailor inspecting every stitch, and where there was inefficiency, he cut. Where there was fraud, he exposed. Where there was decay, he planted new ideas. He believed that wealth should not merely be spent, but produced, built, and maintained. So he encouraged the founding of new industries, protected French artisans, and enforced strict quality control. Tapestries, glass, lace, ships, all began to bear the mark of French excellence under his guidance. He reduced internal tariffs, built roads and canals, and revived trade routes. But more than that, Colbert gave France the beating heart of a modern state. He organised, he centralised, he made tax collection fairer, though never perfect. He created registries, codified laws, and gave the state a backbone of order. And he did it all quietly. While Versailles glittered with the performances of courtiers and mistresses danced in gardens of gossip, Colbert worked behind the scenes. His desk was often lit long past midnight. Piles of documents towered over his ink-stained fingers. But he found satisfaction not in applause, but in the knowledge that France under his hand grew stronger. There was a turning point, of course, for even the most capable minds cannot keep pace with ambition forever. Louis XIV, with growing confidence, began to lean more towards military glories and building vast palaces. The king dreamed not just of a wealthy France, but a radiant one, the Sun King's France. And while Colbert supported these visions, he also worried. War was costly, glory was fleeting. He urged caution, careful spending, the value of savings. But kings, once crowned by fire and fate, rarely listened forever. Colbert began to find himself competing with other ministers, particularly Louvois, who favoured militarization and expansion. Slowly his influence began to wane. He was still respected, still vital, but the tide of decisions no longer always flowed through him. He felt the weight of age, not in his hands or his eyes, but in the sense that the France he was building was being dressed in garments too fine for its pockets. The grandeur of Versailles, the gold, the fountains, he'd helped fund them, yes. But had France grown too bold, too proud? He never stopped working. Even as illness crept into his bones, even as his breath grew shorter, Colbert kept his hand on the wheel. He dictated instructions, reviewed proposals, calculated risks. He was not a romantic hero, but a steady one. When he died in 1683, it was quietly. No grand procession, no dramatic farewell, just the silent closing of a chapter. Louis mourned him, not with tears, but with a certain gravity. He had lost not just a minister, but a foundation. Colbert left behind not palaces or poetry, but something far more lasting: structure. His reforms outlived him. His systems continued long after his signature stopped appearing on paper. He had modernized France, disciplined it, and helped shape it into a power that would dazzle and dominate for decades. But history is often drawn to louder figures: generals, mistresses, kings. Colbert remained in the background of most tales, yet without him, the stories could never have played out the way they did. He was the scaffolding behind the marble. Tonight, as sleep begins to settle over your mind like a gentle fog, picture Colbert alone at his desk. The rest of the palace has gone quiet. Outside, torches flicker in the evening wind. But inside, the minister leans over one more report, one more column of numbers. His face is calm, his expression measured. He knows tomorrow will bring more tasks, and still he is content. Let his steadiness wrap it around you now like a soft blanket. Let the weight of his careful mind guide you to peaceful rest. There is no rush, no grandeur, just quiet purpose. As the world falls still, may the calm diligence of Jean-Baptiste Colbert ease your spirit into gentle sleep. Rest easy, dear dreamer. Let structure cradle your dreams tonight. Sleep well. The Duc de Saint-Simon's sharp-tongued chronicler of court life. In the elegant hush of a candlelit chamber, the sound of scratching quill against parchment lingers in the still air. This is where he feels most at home, not in the grand halls of Versailles, not among the murmuring courtiers, but alone in his study, with thoughts spilling carefully into ink. He is Louis de Rouvroy, Duc de Saint-Simon, born in 1675 into a noble family steeped in tradition and pride. He was not destined for war or finance or great conquest. His calling was memory, sharpened, meticulous, sometimes unforgiving memory. From his earliest years he seemed made to observe, to analyse, and eventually to record. His father had served with loyalty and distinction under Louis XIII, and the name Saint-Simon carried a certain weight in court circles. Yet from childhood, young Louis felt himself set apart, not always by choice, but by nature. While other boys revelled in swordplay or fancied themselves future marshals, he watched, he listened, he questioned, and above all, he judged. In time, he entered the court of Louis XIV, the glittering world of silks, ceremony, and shallow smiles. Versailles was more than a palace. It was a stage, a theatre where every gesture, glance, and gown held layers of meaning. For many it was intoxicating. For Saint-Simon it was a study in hypocrisy and human nature. He played his part well enough, but behind the measured bows and polite laughter, he saw the machinations. He stored each moment in a mental gallery, ready to be painted in prose. He rose in rank, slowly, thanks to his title and his proximity to noble blood. Though he lacked the easy charm of some, his lineage and sharp mind earned him a seat at the table. He served diplomatically, politically, even militarily for a time, but always his true loyalty was to observation. He kept diaries with astonishing regularity, noting not only events but feelings, expressions, and the subtle undercurrents of power that rippled through the royal family and their courtiers. At first there was a period of hope. He believed with the fire of youth that he could influence the monarchy toward honour, that he might guide the crown with reason and truth. He aligned himself with the legitimists, believing strongly in the noble class, in the system of birthright and ancestral responsibility. He hoped that Louis XIV might reward loyalty and tradition, that virtue might still carry weight. But Versailles was not built on virtue. Over time, that early hope eroded. Saint-Simon watched, quietly outraged, as merit and morals gave way to flattery and favouritism. Men of little character rose swiftly through manipulation and charm. Nobles were sidelined by ministers of common birth, and rules bent around royal whim. The Sun King's court, for all its light, cast long shadows. A turning point came with the king's relationship with Madame de Maintenon. Saint-Simon distrusted her influence, her quiet control over the king's decisions, and what he saw as her moral rigidity cloaked in piety. He believed the court was becoming stifled, its hierarchy undermined, its dignity diluted. His writings began to reflect a sharper tone, still elegant, always precise, but edged with disappointment. As the years passed, his view of the court darkened. Scandals erupted, alliances shifted like sand, and Saint-Simon chronicled every detail. He was not unkind for cruelty's sake. His criticism came from a deep belief in order, in what he saw as the proper functioning of nobility and the duty of monarchs. Yet in his pages few escaped scrutiny. Ministers, dukes, duchesses, even the king himself. No one was too sacred to dissect. Despite this, he remained loyal to the idea of monarchy. He did not wish to destroy the system, only to correct it. His pen was a surgeon's blade, cutting not to wound, but to reveal. And sometimes, beneath the scathing remarks, there lay glimpses of admiration, for strength, for intelligence, for those rare moments when grace prevailed in a world so tangled with vanity. The fall came slowly, not dramatically. He lost influence as regimes shifted. Louis XIV's death in 1715 marked the end of an era, and though Saint-Simon remained a voice at court during the regency of Philippe d'Orléans, his style of nobility was fading. The modern state no longer needed chroniclers. It wanted ministers, soldiers, financiers. His ideals felt increasingly out of place. He withdrew more often to his estates, far from the marble whispers of Versailles. There he edited and rewrote his memoirs, adding layers of reflection. The diaries he kept had grown into volumes, millions of words capturing the soul of a court that once ruled the world. He laboured over every line, not for fame, but for posterity. He knew the world might change, might forget him, but he wanted it to remember what the court had been, its triumphs, its vanities, its truths, and its illusions. He died in 1755, long after many of the names he had chronicled had faded. His memoirs would not be published in full until decades later, but when they emerged, they stunned Europe. Here was a voice unfiltered, elegant and brutal, tender and merciless, offering an unparalleled window into a world both beautiful and broken. Tonight, as your thoughts begin to quiet, imagine him at his writing desk once more. The candle flickers beside him, casting long shadows across the walls. The room is lined with parchment and leather-bound volumes. He dips his quill, pauses, considers a moment he once saw, a subtle gesture, a whispered betrayal, and then begins to write. Not to expose, not to shame, but to preserve. Let your mind drift through the silent corridors of Versailles as he saw them. Not just marble and gold, but filled with the hum of ambition, the quiet stirrings of jealousy, and the rare, fleeting glances of true nobility. Let his steady, discerning gaze walk beside you through this dream. In the end, Saint-Simon gave us more than memory. He gave us perspective. He reminded us that behind every throne, every title, there is a person, flawed, fragile, and trying to make meaning in a world forever shifting. Close your eyes now. The court has gone to sleep. The last page has been turned. The ink dries in stillness. As the hush of history surrounds you, let the quiet mind of Saint-Simon lull you into dreams. Sleep gently, dear listener. Tomorrow waits, but tonight belongs to rest. Sleep well. Nicolas Fouquet. Wealthy. Doomed superintendent. In the heart of 17th century France, where the gold of the Sun King began to outshine the stars themselves, a boy was born into privilege, but not quite into power. His name was Nicolas Fouquet, and though his birth in 1615 was cushioned by wealth and noble blood, it would be his ambition, not his name, that would carve his path towards greatness and ultimately towards silence. From a young age, Nicolas was marked by intelligence and elegance. He was not merely clever, but graceful in the way he moved through conversation, the way he handled documents, and the way he made others feel they belonged, even when they did not. He was trained in law and diplomacy, educated in the Jesuit manner, which left him polished and purposeful, a man who understood both virtue and vanity. His rise was steady, quiet, and yet filled with momentum. By his 20s he held administrative roles, and soon after gained the eye of Cardinal Mazarin. Fouquet's blend of loyalty, financial aptitude, and subtle charm made him invaluable to the crown. In a kingdom often teetering on the edge of debt, rebellion, and discontent, a man who could manage wealth was as precious as gold itself. When Mazarin needed someone to control the country's treasury, to weave together the fraying fabric of royal finances, he chose Fouquet. In 1653, at the height of Mazarin's influence, Nicolas Fouquet was named Superintendent of Finances. It was a role not only of numbers, but of immense power, and Fouquet embraced it with the grandeur he believed France deserved. With his control over the finances came an opulence few men in France could rival. Fouquet did not shy away from splendour. He commissioned grand works of art, funded cultural projects, and constructed a palace, Vaux-le-Vicomte, that would leave even kings awestruck. With vast formal gardens by Lenotre, interiors touched by the genius of Lebrun, and architecture by Lavaux, Vaux was not just a home, it was a statement. Fouquet saw himself not merely as a servant of the crown, but as a steward of French glory. For a while all seemed bright. He was admired by poets, artists, and thinkers. The nobility dined at his tables. The king himself was invited to the Grand Fête at Vaux, a celebration of splendour unmatched in recent memory. The sky shimmered with fireworks. The air was rich with perfume and music, and Fouquet stood proud, believing himself secure in his loyalty and success. But beneath the silk and silver of that evening something else stirred. Louis XIV, still young but increasingly confident, looked upon the magnificence of Vaux not with admiration but with suspicion. If a minister could outshine the monarch, what did that mean for the power of the crown? What whispers might grow from such boldness? What shadows did Fouquet cast? The turning point came quietly, with a shift in tone rather than decree. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Fouquet's growing rival, whispered concerns into the king's ear about embezzlement, ambition, and danger. Whether the accusations were entirely fair, history still debates, but they landed with weight. The king, who had long admired Fouquet's brilliance, began to see it as a threat, and so the king planned. Just weeks after Fouquet announced plans to fortify a coastal town, an act Colbert painted as treasonous, the king acted. In September of 1661, while travelling with the court, Fouquet was arrested by D'Artagnan himself. The very hands that had signed royal documents, balanced budgets, and thrown dazzling banquets were now bound. What followed was not only imprisonment but humiliation. Fouquet's possessions were seized, his papers examined, and a trial arranged. It dragged on for years, not because of complexity but because of symbolism. Fouquet, once the steward of the realm, was being remade into a lessons, an example of what happened to those who grew too tall in the Sun King's shadow. He defended himself with grace. He argued not just facts, but his loyalty, his love of France, his vision. He admitted that mistakes had been made, but never treason, never theft. His words, written from prison, carried sorrow but not bitterness. In the end, the court found him guilty, though not unanimously. The sentence, banishment. But the king, unsatisfied, overrode the court and commuted it to life imprisonment. And so Fouquet was sent to the fortress of Pignerol, a stone cage far from the golden gardens of Versailles. There, he faded. No grand rebellion came, no daring escape, just letters to family, occasional visits from loved ones, and the slow erosion of memory. He lived on quietly for nearly 20 years in confinement. The man who once hosted philosophers and kings died, not with a trumpet's call but with a whisper in 1680. Yet his story did not vanish. His fall became a warning to those who dared to outshine the king, a symbol of overreaching ambition in a world where loyalty was not enough. But for some, Fouquet was remembered not as a villain but as a patron of beauty, a man who believed France could be both glorious and generous, a man who dreamed too boldly and paid too dearly. Tonight, as the world outside your window stills, imagine the soft rustle of silk in a candlelit room. Hear the gentle murmur of fountains in the gardens of Vaux. Picture a man at his desk writing by lantern light, not of money or strategy, but of regret, of vision, and of what might have been. Let his story wrap around you like a velvet cloak, not cold but warm with the memory of a man who dared to dream magnificently. Let your breath slow, your mind drift, and your heart find rest in the thought that even in downfall beauty can leave its mark. As your eyes grow heavy, may the rise and fall of Nicolas Fouquet carry you gently into the hush of sleep. Rest now, dear dreamer, and let your thoughts be soft. Sleep well. Madame de Montespan's confessor, torn between duty and scandal. The chapel was dim and cool, a quiet sanctuary within the endless shimmer of Versailles. Incense still clung to the air like memory, sweet and heavy. There, beyond the golden lattice of confessionals, sat a man clothed not in jewels or brocade, but in simple black. He had no title save father, no lands to claim, no tapestries bearing his name. And yet, in the shadows behind the curtain, his ears held secrets more powerful than any sword, any crown, or any mistress's whisper. His name, to most, is lost in time, overshadowed by the woman he served and the sin she confessed. But once, long ago, he was a child with clear eyes and a gentle voice, born to a modest family in the countryside. He had watched his mother kneel in quiet prayer by candlelight, and seen in his father's hands the calluses of work and the humility of service. In those early years the boy believed goodness was simple. One did what was right, and God in his wisdom would bless the righteous with peace. He grew, learned Latin and the scriptures, walked cloisters in silence, and eventually joined the priesthood. The world he entered was not the quiet one he had imagined. The church, even then, moved in the same currents of politics and power as the court. But still, he prayed, counselled, and served. He was known for his calm voice, his discernment, and above all, his discretion. These traits did not go unnoticed. When Madame de Montespan, fragrant with influence, draped in scandal, beloved of the king, requested a confessor, many priests hesitated. She was the most powerful woman in France, yes, but also the most controversial. Her beauty was matched only by her temper, and her place beside Louis XIV was marked by rumours of enchantments, rivalry, and ambition. To hear her confessions would be to cradle fire. Yet the quiet priest accepted. He entered Versailles like a shadow, never the focus, always watching. The glitter of the court did not dazzle him. He had no interest in politics or favour. His purpose was clear: to guide a soul towards salvation, even if that soul wore satin and sin in equal measure. At first, Madame de Montespan regarded him with curiosity. Here was a man who did not flatter, who did not fear her gaze. His words were firm, but never cruel. In the hush of the confessional she spoke, haltingly at first, then with a kind of desperate relief. She confessed more than sins. She shared her loneliness, her fears, her dreams, and the ache of knowing that while the king's affection burned bright now, it could vanish with the next pretty face. The priest listened. He did not judge, but he did not excuse. He reminded her of grace. He offered penance. And slowly something strange happened. The mistress of the king, feared and envied by all of France, began to change. She grew more reflective. Her laughter came less quickly. She asked deeper questions. Her visits to chapel became more frequent. At times she even wept, not for what she had done, but for the emptiness that all her splendour could not fill. For a time the priest believed he had done good. He had not cast her from the king's side, nor had he tried to. That was not his place. But he had opened a door inside her, a door she had long kept locked. And then came the turning. The affair of the poisons crept like a shadow over Versailles. It began in whispers, in back alleys of Paris, in darkened parlours filled with bottles, powders, and strange rituals. Arrests were made, names were spoken. The revelations grew darker, nobles buying potions to gain love, to ensure inheritance, or to bring death. Madame de Montespan's name surfaced. Not as a passing rumour, but as a frequent client of alchemists and fortune-tellers. Witnesses swore she had purchased aphrodisiacs to keep the king's love, and perhaps worse. Tales of black masses and dark incantations swirled around her like smoke. The king was horrified. The court was aghast. The woman who had once glittered brightest now stood accused of calling upon hell itself. And the priest, her confessor, found himself torn in two. He had heard her sins. He had listened as she poured out her soul. Bound by the sacred seal of confession, he could not speak. Even as the court demanded explanations, even as investigators probed for more names, he remained silent. He saw the woman he had counselled fall into despair. The king turned cold. Her enemies grew bold. Versailles, once her domain, now turned its back. Behind the curtain she wept. She begged for comfort. But he could not change what had begun. He offered her only prayer and the knowledge that even in disgrace one could find salvation. He was accused of complicity, not by evidence but by proximity. How could he not have known? How could he have heard such confessions and said nothing? But the church stood behind him. He had broken no vow, revealed no secret. Still, his place at court became unbearable. He asked to be reassigned. He left Versailles quietly, returning to a monastery far from the fire of royal scandal. There, he tended to the sick and the poor, far from velvet and venom. He never spoke of her again. And she, Madame de Montespan, lived on, stripped of glory, separated from the king, raising their children and seeking peace. Some said she repented, others said she never recovered. But the priest never judged. He had seen not just her sins, but her sorrow, not her poison, but her pain. Years passed. The court changed, names faded, new mistresses came and went, but in the still halls of the monastery, the priest continued to pray. He wrote no memoirs, he sought no recognition. When he died, there was no funeral procession, no gilded tomb, only a cross and a name long forgotten. But his story remains, whispered through time, not as a tale of scandal, but as a quiet reminder that even in the heart of corruption there may be those who serve with humility, that sometimes to hold a secret is the greatest burden of all. So now, as your body grows still and your thoughts begin to drift, imagine him once more, in a quiet chapel, the candles flickering low. He leans forward, listening, not to scandal, not to power, but to a soul in need. He listens not to judge, but to understand. And though the world outside rages with politics and passion, within that little space there is only peace. Let that peace surround you now. Let the hush of the chapel, the rustle of robes, and the gentle voice of absolution carry you away from worry. There is nothing more to confess, no scandal left to fear, only rest and silence and sleep. As the night deepens and the world grows soft, may the quiet strength of a confessor's grace guide you into dreams. Sleep well, gentle soul, all is forgiven, all is still. Marie Anne de Bourbon, Louis's legitimated daughter. In a chamber lit by warm candlelight and the distant song of the Seine, a child was born in the spring of 1666, a season when the roses of Versailles began to open, and the court stirred like a restless dream. She came into the world not as a princess of France, though royal blood ran surely in her veins, but as a child between worlds. Her name was Marie-Anne de Bourbon, the daughter of King Louis XIV and his famed mistress Louise de la Vallière. Though she would one day be known as Mademoiselle de Blois, her earliest days were quiet, nestled away from the spotlight, wrapped in fine linens and secrets. Her mother, gentle and devout, looked upon her with both wonder and fear, for the court was no cradle of peace. To be the king's child was to live within a story both privileged and precarious. It was not long before Louis XIV, that towering figure of golden power, chose to acknowledge the child. He signed her into legitimacy, not quite equal to his children born of queenly wombs, but granted the rank of princesse légitimée, with titles, standing, and a place in the great theatre of Versailles. Marie-Anne, though still very young, was lifted from the shadows into a world shimmering with chandeliers and rumours, where every glance carried meaning and every gesture could be remembered. She was raised with dignity, educated with care. Her tutors gave her Latin phrases, polished court manners, and the soft discipline expected of a royal girl. In salons she learned to speak with grace, never too bold, never too silent. Her mother, who had retreated to a convent in sorrow after falling from the king's favour, left her daughter behind in the glittering palace, trusting others to guide her steps. Marie-Anne grew into a beauty, refined and thoughtful, with eyes that often watched more than they spoke. She was observant, never loud in courtly games, and yet never overlooked. She understood her place. Not born of marriage, yet lifted by her father's love, and so she moved with caution, elegance, and care. In time, her father arranged her marriage, for even in affection kings planned carefully. She would become the bride of Louis Armand de Bourbon, Prince of Conti, a match that raised her even higher, threading her into the great fabric of noble alliances. She was only 13 when she was wed, a girl crowned with pearls and expectations, her veil long enough to sweep across dreams she barely understood. The wedding was brilliant. The halls of Versailles glowed, music floated through open doors, and Marianne was dressed like spring itself. But beneath the celebration, something more fragile stirred. For though she was now a princess, and her name carried weight, the bond between her and her husband never bloomed into the tender harmony she may have hoped for. Louis Armand was young, proud, and distant. Their marriage, though respectable in appearance, never deepened into affection. There were moments of formality, brief meetings in public, but behind the embroidered curtains loneliness lingered. Marianne bore it quietly. She did not weep before others. She smiled as needed, danced when called, and kept her sadness folded tightly inside the pages of her life. Then came illness. The court, like any city, suffered waves of disease. In 1685, not long after a royal campaign in Hungary, her husband returned feverish, his skin pale and eyes dim. The physicians whispered, the servants moved with care, but nothing could halt what had begun. Within days, Louis Armand was gone, leaving Marianne a widow at just 19. There was no great public mourning for a love lost, for theirs had never been a love story. Yet her grief was quiet, real, and private. Grief not just for him, but for what might have been, for dreams that had never found soil in which to grow. Now, a widow, yet still young and vibrant, Marianne remained at court. She never remarried. Perhaps she chose solitude, or perhaps the king saw no further use in arranging another match. In Versailles she became a quiet figure, graceful, uncontroversial, but always present. She held herself with dignity, wearing her widow's black with such calm that it became its own form of beauty. She spent her days in reflection, prayer, and occasional conversation with ladies of the court. She observed the world of her father, the rising and falling favourites, the endless entertainments, the subtle power struggles, and all the while she stayed untouched by scandal, a rare thing in a palace where whispers travelled faster than wind. Years passed. She saw the Sun King grow older, saw his glory become heavier, more rigid. She saw her half-siblings grow and marry, rise and fade. She saw new generations enter Versailles with wide eyes and grand hopes, unaware of how quickly light could turn to shadow. And still she endured. Marianne aged gracefully, her features softening, her words growing gentler. She became known not for brilliance but for balance, not for cunning but for calm. Some called her cold, others called her composed. Perhaps she was both, but she remained herself, unmoved by chaos, unbroken by loss. In the quiet of her later years she found a kind of peace. She turned often to her mother's example, visiting convents, engaging in charitable acts, and tending to matters of faith. Her memories were rich, not in passion or drama, but in the simple rhythm of a life lived under great expectation, with quiet courage. When she passed away in 1739 at the age of 72, the court did not erupt in mourning. There were no weeping crowds or lavish monuments, but among those who remembered her, there was respect, a recognition of a life lived in the margins of greatness, marked not by noise but by endurance. And now, dear dreamer, as your thoughts begin to drift into sleep, imagine her once more, walking slowly through the gardens of Versailles in the golden hour of evening. The fountains murmur softly, the roses bloom in perfect order. And there she is, in a gown of deep blue, hands folded, gaze lifted toward the sky, not with sorrow not with longing, but with a quiet understanding that sometimes the gentlest lives leave the most enduring marks. Let her presence guide you tonight, not as a storm but as a breeze. Let her story be your lullaby, soft, steady, serene. As the stars settle above you and the air grows still, may Marianne's gentle spirit guard your dreams. Sleep well, dear listener. The palace is quiet now, all is calm,